In my estimation, the historical Jesus of Nazareth was a disciple of John the Baptist. Jesus calls him the greatest man that's ever lived. Like, who was he? Why is it that Jesus, God himself, according to Orthodox Christianity, would need to be baptized? This is really strange. Christians will say only God can forgive sins. What the hell was going on with John the Baptist then? Everyone's coming out to him for the forgiveness of sins. He's a hugely significant figure with his own ministry. And they come and ask him, are you the Messiah? He says, I'm not the Messiah. Emphasizes that Jesus is more important than he is. But I do find it a little bit suspicious that John is teaching baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. What does that mean? In biblical scholarship for the past few hundred years, it's been mainstream to say that Jesus didn't actually claim to be God. If you read the ESV there, and I'm at the podium and I'm doing my debate, and I say Jesus didn't claim to be God, because look, he said, now imagine my opponent gets up. He's saying Jesus did claim to be God. Take a look at the English Standard Version. That translation, that one word, is crucial to understanding the nature of Jesus and what he's claiming to be. So if you are ever reading the Bible and either something jumps out at you, you think it's important or interesting, or definitely if it's confusing, the first thing that you should always do.
Hey guys, if you're not subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button on the video. And if you don't have time to watch this episode right now, no problem, but I'd really appreciate it if you would save it to your watch later playlist. Finally, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below. Thank you.
Alex O'Connor, thanks for stopping through last minute, man.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Dude, shout out to Alessi, by the way, producer Alessi, for putting this together. So this was literally like 36 hours ago, but I didn't talk to Alessi before he reached out to you. Ironically enough, though, we had Lee Cronin in here maybe like 3-4 weeks ago, and he mentioned David Deutsch about like multiverse theory. And so right after the podcast, I was like, David Deutsch. And it came up to an interview you did with him.
Yes.
I started watching it, and I was like, I've never seen this guy before. And I looked at the channel. I saw you got in a fight with some dude for 20 minutes on camera. I thought that was interesting. I saw the topics you were doing, like from a philosophical standpoint. I'm like, all right, I'm going to subscribe. We're going to follow this. And then, boom, Alessi hits me up, and I'm like, all right, that's the universe saying this needs to happen.
Yeah, there's something going on there. David's great. I just had him back on, actually. It was a really popular episode. I mean, I know people like David Deutsch, but something about that multiverse stuff just really, really piques the interest.
Yeah, what was his exact point on that again? Like, obviously, he believes that could be a thing.
Yeah, well, he believes it is a thing, but he's a quantum... Well, I don't know if he's actually a quantum physicist, but he's got a great deal of interest in quantum physics at the very least. And so he's talking about what's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So in quantum mechanics, there are multiple ways to interpret the data. So you'll have heard that quantum mechanics says that something can be true and false at the same time, or that atoms can be in two places at once. And that's one way of interpreting the data. I mean, it seems as though, for example, an electron, when you imagine it as like a little particle zooming around a nucleus, it's actually this cloud of probability. And when you observe it, the wave function collapses and suddenly it's all in one place. You know, like Schrodinger's cat?
Yes. Yeah,
So
we talked about that a bunch.
Schrodinger's cat is, a lot of people forget or neglect to mention, a reductio ad absurdum. It's supposed to sort of be a bit of a joke.
So a reductio ad absurdum.
A reductio ad absurdum, which is a reduction to absurdity. So I'm we're really off of the deep end
We're
here.
running into
this
it.
is a really useful tool, and you'll have come across it before. It means taking an argument or a position, pushing it to its logical conclusion, and showing that that's absurd. So, for example, suppose you said, I think that we should minimize suffering for everyone. That's what we ought to do. And I said, okay, well, the easiest way to minimize suffering for everybody would just be to kill everyone on the planet, and suffering's gone. But that's a ridiculous conclusion. So I've taken the idea, I've pushed it to its conclusion, shown the conclusion is ridiculous.
Yes.
Therefore, the premise must be wrong, or we have to adapt it or change it. It's called a reductio ad absurdum.
Or change a way to do it.
Yeah. So you might say, oh, okay, then, well, we need to reduce suffering while keeping everyone alive, or something like that. So to disprove an idea, you can take it to a conclusion, show that the conclusion is ridiculous, and say so the idea must be wrong. So Schrödinger does this with quantum mechanics, because quantum physicists are observing weird stuff going on the quantum level, and it looks as though, until you observe a particle, it's in multiple places at once. Yeah. There's like a probabilistic cloud.
Yeah, for people who haven't seen my episodes of Michio Kaku and some of the other ones we talked about, can you just explain the Schrodinger's cat experiment?
Yeah, exactly. So Schrödinger comes along and he says, okay, so if the idea is that quantum randomness, basically when a quantum random event happens, until you observe it, both of them have happened, and sort of both of them are true at the same time, but when you observe it, it collapses into one sort of option. Schrodinger says, okay, well, imagine we've got a cat inside of a box, and we've got this quantum event, which has a 50% chance of killing the cat, and a 50% chance of having the cat remain alive. And that box you can't see through the box. So crucially, you can't observe it. The idea is that if this interpretation of quantum mechanics is true, then because that quantum event both happens and doesn't happen before it's observed, well, if half of the time it kills the cat and half of the time it doesn't, that means the cat must be both dead and alive at the same time until you open the box and find out. And this has captured the imagination of pop culture because the cat is both dead and alive at the same time. And that's the bit that people remember. But people think that this is some kind of like truth about science, that Schrodinger's cat is like this argument as to how a cat can be dead and alive at the same time. No, Schrodinger is doing a reductio ad absurdum. He's saying that's ridiculous. The cat can't be dead and alive at the same time. Therefore, this interpretation of quantum mechanics must be wrong. It can't be that everything exists in this cloud of probability until you observe it, and then suddenly it just snaps into a real position. That doesn't make any sense. So that's what Schrodinger's cat is supposed to demonstrate. And the interpretation of quantum mechanics that this relies upon is called the Copenhagen interpretation. And as I said to David Deutsch, and apparently he said that he's been using this ever since, I said you can't spell the Copenhagen interpretation without cope, which apparently he's picked up on and started using, so I'm quite proud of that one. There is another interpretation of quantum mechanics called the many worlds interpretation, which instead of saying that, like, imagine quantum event, you've got option A and option B.
Yes.
And until you observe it, both kind of happen probabilistically, and then when you observe it, it collapses into one or the other. The many worlds interpretation says that when a quantum decision like that needs to be made, both of those realities exist. Option A and option B both happen in sort of separate branching realities. And when you open the box, you're not collapsing a probability wave, cloud. What you're just doing is finding out which of those branches you're in. You just find out. And so there is another version of events in which you open the box and the cat is dead. And there's another sort of alternate universe, so to speak, in which you open the box and the cat is alive. As far as I understand from David Deutsch, so David Deutsch is a big proponent of this idea, and he's like certain of it. He's like, yes, the multiverse exists. But it's not like, when you think of the multiverse, you imagine like a bunch of orbs sort of existing in the ether next to each other. For him, it's not so much that there are these different separate universes that like exist in one big space, but rather every time a quantum event can go one way or another, there's like a different branch of reality.
Yes.
And that's what the multiverse is. So for him, the multiverse definitely exists, but it's this like quantum multiverse, branches of reality that occur every single time a quantum decision has to be made.
Yeah, Dr. Kaku got me really obsessed with that, like the way that he talks about it. And then when I talked with him, like he was explaining, building upon it about how it's like, he's like, it's almost like the radio is turned to just the right transistor. And at that point, it'll be, we could be in this room and it's you and me, but if you just turn it a little bit this way, they could be like a dinosaur walking through here instead.
Yeah, exactly.
And, it's theoretical, so it could all be bullshit, and probabilistically, maybe it is. But when there's things in the universe that line up that don't make sense, like ideas that will match from across the planet to one place or another, or like Alessi, as we pointed out, reaching out to you when I find your channel and don't say anything. Like, could it be coincidental? We're looking at similar things? Sure. But I always think about that with the deja vus of the world and stuff, where it's like, maybe there's some sort of like little cross-pollination happening. Maybe it's not a full-blown multiverse, but there's something to that transistor radio idea that could create other realities for us.
It would be cool if you could travel between these branches of reality for different reasons as well. It's not just that you could enter a universe in which like you were wearing a blue jumper instead of a red one, but I've thought about this, like, is there another universe in which everything is identical except like time moves at a different rate? When you're in that universe, it feels the same because you're also moving at a slower rate. But compared to the other branches of reality, time is moving slower or faster, which means that potentially by moving between these realities, you could move into a universe that's identical except like further back in time. And so it's kind of this way of maybe regaining the ability to do backwards time travel, which seems impossible within one universe. That's kind of a conjectural, entertaining possibility. But the idea that we could just move between these branches of reality, I think, doesn't work. Like they're essentially impenetrable, because they are literally branches of reality. You'd have to somehow step outside of it, which I think in principle might be impossible. But it's exciting. Another motivation.
It's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a physicist, so I'm not sure about that. But I think if there were any realistic potential for that to be the case, I think theoretical physics would have some kind of grasp on it. A lot of theoretical physics is stuff that, although we'll never do in practice, here are some things we could do, like wormholes, or what would happen if we traveled at the speed of light. And although we'll never do that in practice, you can still do the math and work out what would happen just in principle. But moving between quantum branches of reality or outside of our own universe, I mean, I'm not even sure what it means to go outside of our universe, or like what the mechanism would be. But another sort of motivation for some form of multiverse is the fact that it's not just coincidences like, oh, isn't that crazy? I was just thinking of this guy yesterday and then he called me. It's like the fundamental constants of the universe, the stuff that allows the universe to like exist, are an incredibly finely tuned set of properties.
Yes.
And so a lot of people use this as an argument for God's existence. Other people use it as a motivation to believe in the multiverse, because if the strength of gravity were stronger by an unfathomably small amount, just like the tiniest nudge too strong, then after the Big Bang, everything would have collapsed in on itself and the universe would have imploded.
Why does it have to be one or the other on some of these things? That's one thing I sit up and think about. I'm like, what? Like the two examples you just gave, like God and the multiverse, for example. Why couldn't they both exist at the same time?
Oh, well, they could. That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's certainly possible, but we wouldn't have any sort of considerations or evidence that would point to that, because take that fine-tuning of gravity or whatever constant you want to pick. If you hypothesize, well, that's because God designed it that way, that doesn't rule out a multiverse, but there's no need now for the multiverse as an explanation. So you'd kind of want some other reason to think that the multiverse exists.
Yes.
Doesn't rule it out. I mean, it could exist.
Yeah, makes
but
sense.
you no longer need it as an explanatory tool. Similarly, if you're like a physicist and you say, well, I believe in the multiverse, and that's how we get the fine-tuning of gravity, because there are infinitely many universes with different degrees. And of course, we have to be in the one that has them all tuned perfectly. That doesn't mean God can't exist, but suddenly God is no longer needed as an explanation for the fine-tuning, because you've got the multiverse.
Once again, I have to tell you guys about this game-changing product I use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Pre-Alcohol is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. It's this byproduct, not your dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I've told you guys on multiple ads before that I was a little skeptical the first time I went to use ZBiotics last year, but after I used it at my buddy's wedding, it worked like a charm, and I've used it every night that I go out to drink since. So whether it's vacations, weddings, birthdays, reunions, or just a good night out, get the most out of your upcoming plans by stocking up on your pre-alcohol now. You can do that by going to zbiotics.com/Julian to get 15% off your first order using code Julian, Julian, at checkout. Pre-alcohol is back with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied with your product, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So remember to head on over to zbiotics.com/Julian, that link is in the description below, and use code Julian at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Thank you to ZBiotics for sponsoring this episode and our good times.
So it could be both, it could be neither. But particularly with the fine-tuning, it is the case that if those constants were different, then nothing could exist, like atoms couldn't form. And so your only options are that those constants are so tuned by pure coincidence, by chance. There's one universe and it's just chance. That seems unfathomably unlikely. Or that there's some necessity, there's some reason they have to be that way. or there's design. And so if you think the answer is chance, you end up in the multiverse, because it's so unlikely that there just has to have been millions of universes, and so there happens to be one that the constants are tuned correctly. That's chance. Necessity means you're looking for some kind of theory of everything, some kind of physical law which entails all of these constants, but also would kind of have to be self-justifying or self-explaining.
What do you mean by that?
Because even if you found some single theory which explained why gravity is the strength it is, why the strong and weak nuclear forces are the way they are, and they all collapse into one law, you'd still kind of have to explain that law. Like, why is that law the way it is? And it depends on the nature of the law, but it might be some other kind of constant. They might all collapse into one constant.
And it's all encompassing in the sense that if there's one chip within that row of that law that falls, it means the entire law falters.
The whole thing with the universe couldn't exist. So then you just push the problem back and have to ask, well, why is that fundamental law that way? And so it would have to somehow be like self-justifying. Like at the basis of a lot of our thought are some self-justifying ideas, like the idea that that a proposition can't be true and false at the same time. The law of non-contradiction, all of our logical thinking rests upon that assumption. But you can't prove that assumption. It's just something that we just think is true. It's just self-evidently true. If there's some kind of scientific equivalent of that at the basis of the universe, then okay, maybe you've got necessity. So you've got chance, you've got necessity. But the third option here is that the constants are so finely tuned because they're designed that way. And that's where you get people arguing for the existence of God.
Do you ever sit up at night, like, stressed about all these things that you think about? Because you are literally, your entire basis of philosophy all comes back to the very meaning of life itself. And, like, I think about this stuff a lot, too, but I don't, I talk about a lot of different things in here. It's not all looking at this, but do you ever sit up at night?
Not really. Not so much, because I'm extremely interested in this kind of stuff, but I don't have the kind of existential like dread that a lot of people report. And I think part of the reason for that is because of my violent agnosticism.
Violent agnosticism.
Yeah, I mean, like I've got no idea if we live in a multiverse or if there's a God and that's why the constants are so finely tuned, or if there's something obvious that we're just like totally missing, or like I just don't know. And so it might keep me up in the sense of wondering about it, thinking that's kind of interesting, but not in the sense of dread, because I'm not confident enough in any view to be like anxious about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand that.
So I don't sort of have that fear. If anything, the thing that keeps me up is like interesting implications of views that are just fascinating, more so than like, man, what does it all mean and stuff. It's like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like this is kind of fascinating. Like there's the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. People use this all the time. Christopher Hitchens, famous atheist journalist, famously said in the back of a car once that this is the argument that gives him pause for thought, that everything is just perfectly balanced. Why would it be that way? And like, I've been really interested recently in some of the non-canonical Christian literature. So like Gnostic Gospels, other stuff that sort of isn't in the Bible, and
We'll
alternate religious views, right? And one of these alternate views in the history of Christianity is the idea that there are kind of two gods in a way. There's like an evil demiurge who creates the material world, and the material world is evil and bad and terrible. And there's the spiritual realm, which is good. And we're sort of trapped in the material realm. And so some of these heretical views believe that, for example, the God of the Old Testament is this demiurgic creator, evil or incompetent creator of the material world. And Jesus comes from the spiritual realm to come and help us break free of our material conditions, right? So that's a bit of a weird, wacky, dualist view, right?
Dualist view?
Well, dualist in the sense of there being sort of two realities.
Okay.
It's like the material world and the spiritual world.
Is that a British word? Dualist?
Dualist, as in like dualism, so like dual, like two.
Okay, so no.
In different contexts, it means different things.
Okay.
So in the philosophy of mind, for example, if you're a dualist, it means that you believe that the mind is immaterial, but you've also got like a material brain. So there's like a physical thing, and there's also the mental thing, and they're distinct. There's two of them. It's called dualism.
Got it.
As
Okay.
opposed to monism, like mono, one, which means that either if you think that all there is the brain and there's no immaterial mind, you're a monist because there's only one thing, it's just the brain. Some people think that there's only the spiritual and that the material world is essentially either an illusion or something. And
I thought you were
That's monism
saying
too.
dualism, not dualism.
dualism.
Yeah.
Sorry,
okay.
yeah.
All right. That's the second time today.
Dualism.
Gary Harrington did that too.
It's an accent thing.
Got it. Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of dualist.
Got it.
In that there are these two realms, the evil, whatever. That's besides the point. The interesting thing is the fine tuning argument. One question that comes to mind is, okay, so everything is super finely balanced, and if something changed by the smallest amount, the universe couldn't exist. You might want to ask, like, why is it like set up that way? Like, okay, so there's one question as to how, given that they have to be finely tuned, they are finely tuned. That's a mystery. But why do they have to be finely tuned? Why are there like meta conditions such that it's seemingly incredibly difficult to create a functional material world? And so a friend of mine came along and said, you know, this Gnostic idea that there's a good God and that the creation of the material world is some evil or incompetent act of a demiurgic sort of bad creator. Could it be that the true creator didn't want the material world to exist because the material world is evil, and so sets up the meta conditions such that it's extremely improbable that a material world would ever exist because he doesn't want that.
The whole material world's evil.
The whole material world is evil according to these Gnostics.
To go on a little tangent on that for a second, though, because I want to understand.
Yeah.
We live in a world where there's war, right? That's evil.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just stay with that example. Within war, there's stories of people, though, who save other people at a cost of their own life.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Yeah, but it's only good insofar as it overcomes a bad thing, right?
Yes.
In that, like, and also, what is it that's good about doing that?
You're saving the life of another person and putting it before your own.
Yeah, sure. So there are a few ways that you can think about this. Like, the first thing is that all of the bad stuff comes from the existence of the material world. Because of the material world, we have suffering. We have bodies that can be put in danger and can suffer. And yeah, that does give you the capability to save somebody, to overcome something. But you'd still rather have none of that altogether. An analogy might be that, like, chemotherapy is a really good thing, right? Chemotherapy is wonderful because it helps people overcome cancer.
Okay, I'll let you continue with that.
But if I said, like, cancer's really bad and we should get rid of it, and you said, well, hold on a second, cancer's really bad, yeah, but it does allow us to do this really good thing of chemotherapy. Without there being cancer, we couldn't have chemotherapy. And chemotherapy is wonderful. Yeah, chemotherapy is great, but only because it overcomes something bad. And we'd rather just not have the bad thing altogether, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, like, sacrificing yourself, throwing yourself on a grenade for somebody else is like a good thing. But if you could have no grenade and no need for the sacrifice, that would be better.
Right, but then what about lower scale good things that just happen when people do good things just to do good things? Like someone's 20 meters behind and I see them coming to the doormat and I decide to wait and hold the door for them.
Yeah, but
there wasn't a bad thing that led to that.
If you want to get really, like, techie about it, like, why is that a good thing? Because it means they don't have to push the door for themselves anymore.
Because it's a nice thing. Yeah, it's a nice thing to do.
Yes, it's nice to make it such that they don't have to push the door.
Yes.
Pushing the door is a physical action that causes some level of, like, stress on the joints or whatever. That's why you do it, right? And so that sounds really trivial.
Yeah, no,
but it's also trivially good. Like, it's a good
Yes.
thing, but it's not like some amazing great thing. It's kind of trivial, but that's because it overcomes a trivial problem with the material world, which is that you have to navigate it, you have to push things, you have to effort to move around and stuff. So for Gnostics, the good thing about people, about all of us, is the spiritual stuff. Is like the non-material stuff that's inside of you. That's what goodness is, you know? And all of our ills come from this material world. And we're constantly in this battle between the material world and our, like, spiritual selves. And if you think about the fact that, you know, somebody wants to have a loving relationship, but they're addicted to pornography. It's like the soul versus the material, like, body. You know, somebody wants to be the best and most productive person they can be, but they're too lazy and they can't be bothered to hit the gym or whatever. And it's like a physical impairment on the things that they want to achieve, you know, and so all of the bad stuff comes from the existence of the material world. It's not just Gnostics who think this, by the way. There are all kinds of philosophical views throughout history that sort of posit the material and the spiritual as kind of in battle with each other.
Yes.
Or more broadly, maybe just the good and the bad. There are like good forces and bad forces, and they're in like a battleground on Earth. For the Gnostics, and Gnosticism is a broad term. A lot of scholars think it shouldn't be used because it describes so many varying views. But broadly speaking, you could say that you've got material world, bad, spiritual world, good. And that we have essentially, as spiritual beings, that's what our soul is, we have been trapped in a material world. And that material world has been created by an evil or an incompetent, like, creative being, sometimes called the demiurge.
Mm-hmm.
And that the ultimate goal of life is to escape from that material trapping and regain our place in the spiritual realm.
So the material world is where we're then forced to experience pain, suffering to varying degrees that ends inevitably in death because we're in a place that we spiritually should not be.
That's right, yeah. And we shouldn't be here at all. So for Gnostics, the creation of the world is essentially a cosmic disaster.
Disaster.
Something went wrong. And if you read some of this Gnostic literature, which we only really rediscovered in the 20th century, like this is new. You know?
Why did we rediscover it in the 20th century?
So we've known for a long time. And by the way, I'm talking in the context of Christianity here, right?
Okay.
So Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And so in mainstream Christianity, the thing that saves you is the sacrifice of Jesus. Yeah. Jesus dies on the cross and he resurrects, and that's why you're saved. For the Gnostic Christians, it's not really about what Jesus did. It's about having the right knowledge. Jesus brought knowledge, and if you know the right stuff, that's what will save you.
Meaning you can access that within you.
Yeah, so it's very like inward looking.
Yes.
It's very knowledge based. Like some of these Gnostic Gospels don't even mention the crucifixion or the resurrection, or they have a different interpretation on what was going on there. And so within the Christian tradition, the Gnostics believe that the thing that's important is knowledge. And so they have their own sort of scriptures, and these are like later than the books we have in the New Testament, and they're condemned as heretical. So the sort of early Christian church.
Which books are you talking about, to be specific?
So in the New Testament, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right?
That's right.
There do exist other Gospels. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas.
Philip, right?
The Gospel of Philip, yes. And also other like letters.
Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, and some of them are much more tenuous than others. There are some really interesting, obvious forgeries, for example. But you've also got like apocalyptic literature. So like the Apocalypse of Peter, which is incredibly interesting. I think there are actually 2 of those. And there's all these texts that people are writing. And at some point in the early church, you've got these texts floating around, and you've also got people claiming to be Paul the Apostle and writing letters in his name, and they're not really written by him and stuff. And so at some point people decide we should start putting together some kind of scriptural canon. Interestingly, the first person to give this a go that we know of is called Marcion. Marcion, yeah. And Marcion decides to
God, you say everything way cooler than us. I'm like, Marcion? Marcion.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, he's cool and Gnostic, but it's a little unclear as to exactly what his views are, because he doesn't have this crazy cosmic theology. But the one thing that he does have that's Gnostic is he thinks, like, he reads what we now call the Old Testament. So he reads like the Hebrew scriptures, and he reads about a God who is like a bastard. He's like committing genocide and slavery, and he's jealous, and he's punishing people and all of this kind of stuff. And then he reads these texts that have begun to emerge, which eventually become the New Testament, these Gospels, and he's like, this Jesus figure is kind, and he's about love and all of this kind of stuff. So for Marcion, he decides, I'm going to put together a biblical canon. The entire Old Testament is omitted. It's not in there.
Why did he make that? Just because Jesus wasn't there at the time?
Because he reads the Gospels and he's like, okay, Jesus is our guy. Jesus is this God figure, this spiritual being that we're all approximating. And when he reads the Hebrew scriptures, he doesn't recognize that God in those scriptures. He thinks this God is evil. This God looks to be a monster. And so this cannot be the God that I'm worshipping through Jesus. It has to be something else. So Marcion thinks that the God of the Old Testament is this demiurge I mentioned earlier, this evil creator of the material world. The material world is bad. The God described in the Old Testament is the creator who brought about the material world, evil guy. So all of the Old Testament is gone. And all that we have left is like a slightly shortened version of the Gospel of Luke, and I think 10 out of 13 of Paul's letters that ended up in the New Testament. So the first attempt at a Christian Bible actually just excludes the Old Testament on these grounds, that the Old Testament God is evil and
I never
incompetent.
heard that before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, you've pulled it up there. It'll probably say something about compiling the... so he considered himself a follower of... Marcion preached that God had sent Jesus Christ, who was distinct from the vengeful God, brackets demiurge, who had created the world. He considered himself a follower of Paul the Apostle, whom he believed to have been the only apostle of Jesus Christ. His doctrine is called Marcionism. He published the earliest record of a canon of New Testament books. And so his canon didn't include the Old Testament, because as it says there, he believed that this vengeful God of the Old Testament is an evil being. There's a text that he wrote, I forget what it's called. There was some text that he wrote which we don't actually have anymore, but it just compared the Old Testament God and Jesus. It just like lists out things that the Old Testament God does and things that Jesus does. And
we don't have it anymore.
We don't have it
meaning
anymore.
It got destroyed or lost.
For whatever reason, we don't have it. It might have been destroyed. It might have been lost, but we have it through the works of his enemies. So like people were responding to him at the time. And so we know what's in there because people were writing about it. And so we know that Marcion is comparing the Old Testament God with Jesus and saying, this doesn't line up. This doesn't line up at all. God is saying an eye for an eye. Jesus is like subverting that and saying turn the other cheek. You know,
Right.
God is committing genocide. Jesus is saying love your neighbor. All of this kind of stuff. And so he just concludes that this Old Testament God is evil and bad and terrible. So that's the earliest like attempt at a Christian canon that we get. But like the early church that develops and becomes the Christian church that we know today takes a different view. It believes that the Hebrew Scriptures are legitimate. And it lands on these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as the four Gospels that people should be reading. And the earliest account we have of that is Athanasius, who he writes this like tract saying, only read these four books and don't read the rest of them. And
when did he write that?
This is like, I don't know, you should look it up to be sure, but I think we're looking at like 3rd or 4th century.
So around the time of the Council of Nicaea?
Yeah, so one big
ballpark?
misconception is that the Council of Nicaea like set the scriptural canon. That's not true. That might be Da Vinci Code inspired, I think.
Yeah, well, there's stuff in there that's also fictional.
They didn't... It's not... Look up Athanasius canon or something. Athanasius.
Oh, I can't spell that.
Spelling is not Alessi's strong suit.
A-T-H-A-N, Athanasius. There you go.
Yeah, Alessi kills it on our channels with titles and stuff. And he's extremely smart, but like,
so
he and I joke behind the scene. The one thing he can't do is spell. He has some.
I'm pretty bad at that too,
spellings.
actually. I'm really, really bad at spelling, especially doing it out loud. But yeah, you can see he's 3rd and 4th century. So it will have been in the 4th century, like early 4th century, that he writes this. And it might even say something there about it. I'm not sure, but
and you're saying that at the Council of Nicaea, that was not scripturally where they defined
Council of Nicaea was about determining like church doctrine, specifically like relationship
Jesus
of
is divine.
all of this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Like what is this Jesus stuff actually about? The canon is a separate thing, and it might have been determined earlier or elsewhere, but the earliest version that we have is Athanasius saying only read these 4 texts. And so after this, what probably happens is some kind of suppression or like virtuous destroying. Like people might do it of their own accord because they're not supposed to be reading these other texts, but these other texts sort of fall out of fashion. They're not spread around. They sort of exist in different esoteric groups, and there are some like smaller groups that have cropped up with their own scriptures and stuff. Some which are more popular and travel around, but for whatever reason, they end up sort of getting like lost. Either they're destroyed or people just forget about them or whatever. We just don't have them. But we know that they exist because in the 4th century, in the 2nd century, Irenaeus is a early church father who writes a text called Against Heresies.
Mm.
And this is a huge text which basically argues against every single Christian heresy which he knows exists, and sort of says why it's wrong, why you shouldn't believe this, why you shouldn't believe that. And he's writing about these other views. He's writing about a gospel of Judas, and so we have Irenaeus's work, and we know that he's writing about this gospel, but we don't have the gospel. And so for the longest time, all we knew about these texts was through their enemies. And you can learn a thing or two, but obviously it's always going to be skewed if you don't have the original literature. Then in the 1940s, there is a teenage farmer in the desert in Egypt, near a place called Nag Hammadi. And he's digging in the desert, and he comes across this jar. And he's scared to open it at first because he's scared it's got a jinn in it, like a devil, right? Yeah. He's terrified to open it. And eventually it gets opened up, and there's a bunch of old papyrus in there. And so the story goes, he takes it home, and his mother uses some of the papyrus to feed the fire, Yeah. And eventually it's sort of it's realized that these are sort of worth something. So it's a bit of an insane story, actually, and I don't know all of the details, but this is where a lot of our Gnostic literature comes from. And so we've got there are these Coptic translations. Coptic is an Egyptian dialect, and there's Coptic translations of Gnostic texts. So the Gospel of Thomas, for example, the Gospel of Judas actually isn't in this text, but the Gospel of Thomas is, for example, probably the most famous Gnostic gospel, although it might not even be Gnostic. And it's our only copy that we've ever found of this gospel. And so just by chance, this guy happened to find this jar, and now we have.
And they didn't burn that one for papyrus.
No, that one was not burned. Interestingly, the Gospel of Judas, which was found not as part of this collection but nearby.
That has some burn marks.
Yeah, you can see. Look at it. So look underneath. See that one down there. That's the Gospel of Judas, right? So this is found in a different. I think it's found nearby, but it's not found in the Nag Hammadi library. And the Gospel of Judas, this spends a long time in private hands because people are trying to sell it. People really want to sell this. And so I can't remember when this is discovered. I think it's discovered maybe in the 70s or 80s or something. And it spends decades. It might have been slightly earlier than that. Maybe you can look that up actually to be sure. Just if you click on the Gospel of Judas. It spends decades traveling around, private sellers trying to sell it. The thing about Egypt is it's got the perfect climate for the preservation of papyrus. That's why these things last for so long, and that's why we always find them in Egypt, because it just happens to have the perfect air to make sure that these things don't disintegrate. Someone takes the Gospel of Judas, and for example, it spends about 16 years in a safety deposit box in New York City, which almost destroys it.
16 years?
Something like that, yeah. It might have been more like 10 or 15.
How did it get to New York City?
Because people are moving around trying to sell it. Somebody's trying to find a buyer, because this thing is absolutely golden. This is an unbelievable gospel, right? And it's huge, and it's going to change the whole face of New Testament scholarship, right? Eventually, National Geographic buy it and publish it. And I think they publish it in 2006 or something like that. So it's been going around for decades, and it's only at the turn of the millennium that finally the Gospel of Judas is available for people to read. But it's a crazy story. And here's the really weird thing, man, is that people think, why? So the Nag Hammadi library, again, that's not where the Gospel of Judas is found, but people want to ask the question, why was it buried in the desert? And so one popular suggestion was, well, when Athanasius said only read these 4 Gospels, the rest of them are buried, either to hide them or keep them secret, or because they've been condemned, get rid of them, put them in the desert. And that's the theory for the longest time. But then there's this whole weird story about how the farmer boy mentions that there was a corpse, and his older brother is no, there was no corpse. I don't know what he's talking about. And so there is this suggestion that this was actually a grave robbing, because it was quite common to bury papyrus, documents with people who died. And so there is an idea that these guys were out there trying to rob a grave, and they happened upon this expensive set of papyrus. And
Do
so
we have speculation of whose grave it could have been?
I don't think we have an idea of whose grave it could have been, no, because we don't know much of the details. I'm not even sure if we know the exact location where it was found, because it was just, like I say, some teenage farmers in a desert. But so it's this extremely strange and slightly shady story of how it's all discovered, because
I'll say.
there's something about like a blood feud. I think there's some cannibalism in the story there somewhere, to be honest. It's like a whole...
They're just hitting every single keyword.
It's like a whole thing. And yeah, I mean, the story is really crazy. But so some people have shifted from thinking, well, they were buried there because of Athanasius's declaration, and then it's like actually they were buried with somebody as part of their like burial properties. There's probably a word for it. I forget what it's called, but like ceremonial burying people with their documents, and that they were trying to rob a grave, and then they came across them, and it's all a bit of a mess. But eventually, we have access to all of these ancient gospels, and like I say, we knew that these existed. But now we have the texts themselves. So the Gospel of Judas is one of my favorites. When does it say it was discovered or rediscovered?
That has been carbon dated to 20 AD.
So notice it says, given that it includes late 2nd century theology, it's widely thought to have been composed in the 2nd century, brackets prior to 180 AD by Gnostic Christians. It's been carbon dated to 280 AD, plus or minus 60 years. So how do we know that it's prior to 180 AD? Because that's when Irenaeus wrote against heresies, and he mentions the Gospel of Judas. So we can carbon date it to 280 AD plus or minus 60 years,
and then use the previously known information.
But that's this copy that we have, right? Which is a Coptic translation. So when was the text originally written? Well, it's been mentioned. So there are multiple ways that we can sort of date documents, but the actual copies that we have, like the Nag Hammadi library, is probably, I think, again, these particular scriptures are dated to like maybe the 3rd to 5th century, maybe 4th or 5th, I can't remember exactly. But one interesting question is, well, when are these manuscripts from? Are they from like the 4th century? That's cool. But when were the texts written? That's the most interesting question. And, they weren't originally written in Coptic. What language were they written in, and when were they written?
It's also, this is another, like, sticking point for me with any of this. Like, when we think of our current history, 10 years ago feels like a long time.
Yeah.
To an extent. And then you start looking 60, 70 years out. That's like when your great-grandparents were kids.
Yes.
When you start looking at history, the farther away it gets, though, time kind of has a wider lens, and at least in how we approach it, which means we hear years like, I'm going to throw out random numbers, 140 AD and 210 AD, and associate it with almost the same about time.
Yes.
But it's fucking 70 years apart at a time where the record keeping was you wrote something in the fucking sand.
Yeah. Not only that, but it's important to note, especially when we're talking about Gospels, that, for example, most scholars date the Gospel of Mark, which is our earliest canonical Gospel, to around 70 AD. And there are various reasons for doing that. Matthew and Luke are generally dated like between maybe 75 to like probably 85, that kind of decade, like 10 or 15 years after Mark.
And they say Christ died in like around 33
Around 30,
AD.
33 AD, yeah. And so John's Gospel is then probably between like 90 and 100 AD. Now, compare that to like, suppose the Gospel of Thomas. Suppose we just proved beyond reasonable doubt that it was dated to 150 AD. Right? And that's probably around about when it was written, sort of 2nd century. Some people think it was dated earlier, but that's controversial. Suppose it was 150 AD. You might think, okay, John's Gospel's written in 90 AD, and the Gospel of Thomas is written in 150 AD. So roughly about the same time, right? So no big difference between them. But in this context, that could be the difference between like an eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life still being alive and still being dead.
Yes.
Like if Mark is written in 70 AD, that's still like 40 years after Jesus dies.
Yep.
But 40 years is a short enough time that people could still be alive. It could have been written by an eyewitness. It could have been written by someone who knew an eyewitness. That extra few decades is the difference between eyewitness testimony being possible and being impossible. So it does actually make a huge difference.
Even on that thread, though, eyewitness testimony itself also changes naturally without people like trying to lie or stuff. You remember details in a small way. Like the example I always give is the old experiment, I forget what it's called, where you put 20 people in a circle, you start with a story.
Telephone game.
Yeah, the telephone game. You whisper it in their ear and go down the lane, and it changed by
Yeah.
10% or something, or 20% by the end, through no fault of people other than just human error. And it's like, it's not to sit here and be a total skeptic about everything, but it's like when you take something as law or canonical law, whatever you want to say, that's like, this is what happened 100%, we have the proof. It's like, all right, you are relying on like, I'm even talking about the ones where you still have an eyewitness testimony person alive, right? Forget the other ones you point out where you don't. You are relying on the word of flawed human beings, which we all are, to assume that everything that was said is how it is. And we even see that some of these people are coming up with different versions of the same thing who lived at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's a common analogy that's given is the telephone game. Bart Ehrman talks about this a lot. I do think that it's not wholly appropriate for something like the Gospels, because the point of the telephone game is you only get to hear it once. And the fun is that you then have to hope you hear it right and pass it on. And you're kind of trying to make it go wrong, because that's why it's funny. With important traditions, you pass it on and you check you've got it right. So you're going to tell me something, I'm going to repeat it back to you. You're going to correct any misunderstandings. I'm going to make sure I have it memorized, and then I'm going to pass it on to my children, for example. And so the oral transmission of religious traditions, I think, is a lot more reliable than people often realize, because, like you say, this was the only way that information is transpired. Like, imagine if you're learning something important, you're learning about your family history, or you're learning something for class or whatever, and you're not allowed to write it down.
Yeah.
And it's not written in a book anywhere else. You would probably put a lot more effort into remembering exactly what was said.
That's true.
And so that's passed down a lot better. But I am suspicious, for example, when people say we have so much of Christology, which is the study of the nature of Jesus, relies on his exact words. Like it says in the Gospels that Jesus used this phrase, and this is really important. Why did he say that instead of this? When it gets that specific, I get highly suspicious, right? You're listening to me very carefully right now, right? You're paying attention to the words I'm saying?
Of course.
Okay, excluding the sentence I just said. Can you repeat my previous sentence to me?
Word for word? No.
No. Can't even come close. You probably couldn't even really paraphrase it very well. But you're paying
Because
attention quite well.
I am transcripting the information you have and translating it into understanding what you're saying versus the exact words and lingo and prepositional phrases you're using to land it there.
Exactly. And so you can't remember the words that I spoke 20 seconds ago. And I'm expected to believe that the gospel authors, who were writing at best decades after the death of Jesus, remembered the exact words that he'd spoken. I'm not convinced of that. There is an idea that people had been traditionally like remembering the words that he'd said and passing them on to each other and sharing them and authenticating them against different independent traditions, and that can be true. But when it's as important as in this particular instance, did Jesus call himself the Son of Man or a Son of Man? And that actually makes a big difference.
Yes.
Then I think we need to be a lot more suspicious.
Hey guys, if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It's a huge, huge help. Thank you.
There are, in to play devil's advocate on some of that though, in our own lives, forget even something as serious as like Jesus or a historical figure, in our own lives, you may listen to someone talking with you for an hour, right?
Yes.
And you're talking about something serious with them. And to your point, I can't remember what they said 30 seconds ago in the exact words, but at some point, the drama of the situation lines up that they land the plane and they say something that isn't, those words are ingrained in your head forever.
Yes.
So there could be some of that.
And that's what probably happens in a lot of these cases with Jesus. So really, really big Christological moments. In John's Gospel, Jesus appears in chapter 8 to invoke the divine name. He says to his Jewish opponents, before Abraham was, I am. And I am, ego eimi in Greek, is thought by many to be a callback to the name that God gives Moses as his own name, Eesha in the Hebrew, which kind of means ego eimi, which is what Jesus says. And so if Jesus really did say something like that, it is the kind of thing that would stick in the mind.
Yes.
The mystery then is why only John's Gospel reports it, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have no mention of such an event. So there are other reasons to suspect the historicity of that event. But a lot of reading into the words of Jesus isn't just the big headline obvious stuff like that. It's more specific stuff, like the Son of Man stuff. Jesus uses the title Son of Man for himself all the time. It's like he uses it more than any other title for himself, I think. And it's a bit of a mystery what it means, because Son of Man in Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke, is just a sort of slang term that means human being. Bar Nash. It just means human being. So you would say that person is a son of man. It just means that they're a human being. You know, they were born of a human being. Weirdly, the Greek New Testament consistently has Jesus use the definitive article, the Son of Man, which is a really clunky Greek phrase. It's not something that just sort of gets lost in translation. It was very particular. It was done on purpose. It's not a Son of Man. It's the Son of Man.
Yes.
So we've got this title, the Son of Man, which we associate with Jesus. But a lot of scholars think that the way we should sort of think about this is as if, because Son of Man just means human being, it's as if someone was going around calling himself the human being or the one in like the Matrix sense.
Yeah.
Which until something like the Matrix popularizes that usage would be really clunky and strange. But it seems like Jesus might have been doing something like that. Like, I am the human one, you know? It's extremely strange. But if there were some instances where he was actually just saying, I am a human, it would totally change the interpretation of a verse. So, for example, have you ever heard the phrase, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath? Have you ever heard this before?
I don't think so. No.
So the Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, right? It's the seventh day of the week. And in Jewish law, you have to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Jesus is working on the Sabbath. His Jewish opponents come up to him and say, you're working on the Sabbath, because they're trying to catch him out. They don't like him. They want to well, eventually crucify him. So they say, you're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus goes, have you not read what David did? And he says that King David does the same thing. He sort of works on the Sabbath when he has to. And then he says that that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So in other words, the reason that the Sabbath exists is for humankind's sake. You know, it's so that we get our day of rest.
Yes.
And so the criticism he's making of the Jews there is that they've become too legalistic. They sort of forgot the whole reason why the Sabbath exists in the first place. It's not just there because God hates it when you work on the Sabbath. It's there for your sake. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus then says, therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Meaning he gets to decide what happens that day.
Well, that's the thing, right? Who is the Lord of the Sabbath? The Lord of the Sabbath is God. God is the one who...
I thought it was Ozzy Osbourne.
God is the one who institutes this. yeah, he's the other Son of Man.
Fuck.
In the Gnostic Gospels, they associate Ozzy Osbourne. The person who institutes the law about the Sabbath and the Ten Commandments is God. So God is the Lord of the Sabbath. But here's Jesus saying, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Me, the title I'm using, the Son of Man, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. So he's claiming to be God. Unless this is a tradition that's been lost in translation, and Jesus actually said Son of Man just to mean human beings.
Over and over again, though?
Well, some scholars like Morris Casey think that that's what's happened. I think that's dubious. I think that
seems like a stretch.
The use of the definitive article is too strong to think that Jesus wasn't sometimes using it essentially as a kind of title. But this instance, for example, check it out, right? So he says, can you go to the version in Mark's Gospel? Can you type in Mark, Lord of the Sabbath? Yeah. Mark is our earliest Gospel.
We also, by the way, I haven't been saying this whole time, but a whole nother rabbit hole here is the translation.
Yeah, that's
of all these Gospels.
So much of that is
where one article can be here instead of there.
I've got something for you on that. So
does it start with Amen?
Go back and go to the actual. Just type in Mark 2 into that where it says there. Just type Mark 2. And hit enter. Okay, and then scroll down until you keep scrolling. Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. So he said, right. So they come up to him, the Pharisees say, look, what he's doing is unlawful on the Sabbath. Jesus answers, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? So they enter into the temple and eat the bread that only the high priest is supposed to eat. So first thing to notice is Jesus is justifying his breaking of the Sabbath by pointing to another human being and saying, well, he did the same thing. He then says, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So, and the word does mean therefore, the word so there, it does actually mean therefore in the Greek. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So, a traditional Christian interpretation of this is Jesus is claiming to be God because he claims to be the Lord of the Sabbath, which is only God. But if this has been lost in translation, which I suspect of this verse, and Jesus in this instance meant Son of Man, in the Aramaic colloquial sense of just meaning a human being, all he's saying is that human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, humans are Lord of the Sabbath, Sabbath isn't Lord of human beings. Which, hold on a second, is exactly what he's just said in other words. So my interpretation here, that Jesus is just saying that the Son of Man, what he actually said was like, Son of Man as in human beings.
Yes.
Now reread the verse with that interpretation in mind. They accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. He says, well, David did the same thing. And then he says, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. Because he's just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind.
Is he essentially saying that, like, instead of trying to treat this like a law that you're dictating your whole life around to feel like you're doing the right thing, it's really supposed to be a guideline as a method to how to live your life in a good way?
In this instance, I don't know if I'd phrase it in those terms, that it's just like
It's
a
polite
guideline.
way of saying fuck no.
No, because I think you're probably about right, but I think saying guidelines is too loose. Like it's not like, well, these are rules, but they're only guidelines, so break them if you want to. It's more like understand what the purpose of the law is. The law is there for your sake. You know. But what I'm trying to bring out with this particular verse is that I think that is the interpretation of what's actually happening here. But the specific words here, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. It's a little bit weird and clunky because he's just said that David broke the Sabbath and that was fine. He's just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind and then suddenly shifts to talking about himself. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Because he's not mankind.
Why has he just spoken about David breaking the Sabbath? Why has he just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind? And then suddenly he's talking about himself. Doesn't it make more sense if he would say, well, David broke the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was made for mankind, therefore mankind is Lord of the Sabbath?
I see what you're saying.
Therefore, I think when he says here, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, I think it's probably not a mistranslation from the Greek, but the Greek itself is probably a misreporting of what actually happened here. And Jesus was just saying that mankind is Lord of the Sabbath, not the Son of Man as a title. You know what I mean?
I could see that one both ways because and maybe this is a way too simplistic way of looking at it, but he's looking at he's using David as an example of a great man among humankind, not to say like he's above man or anything, and then relating back to himself and saying, but by the way, like I'm the Son of Man, so I can actually dictate
so that's another great interpretation. Is he saying like, well, David did it, and I'm so much greater than David because I'm the Son of Man, so of course I can do it too. That's another interpretation. The key is that it's not always obvious. And a lot of it has to do, the reason I brought this example up is because, by the way, I might be wrong there. Maybe this is an authentic tradition and he really did say the Son of Man, meaning himself is Lord of the Sabbath. That might be true. But the important thing is here that there's a lot more room, in my view, in an instance like this, for someone to have slightly misremembered what he said. Especially if Jesus had been going around claiming himself to be the Son of Man. And he had been saying, like, I am the Son of Man constantly. And then in this instance, he used the phrase Son of Man in the non-titular sense. It would be so obvious, it would be so easy for me to imagine that somebody sort of misremembers. And they sort of go, yeah, remember when Jesus said the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and they record it that way? So the whole, why I said, can you remember my sentence 20 seconds ago, is to indicate that in some instances, I think there is a lot more wiggle room for just thinking that something has been misremembered. Whereas if Jesus were to have said, before Abraham was I am, that's so specific that it's unlikely that would be remembered wrongly. So I think it applies sometimes, but not other times.
I think that's very fair because, like I said, there's different, for lack of a better way of putting it, there's different levels of drama that occur with the context of what you're saying and where you're saying it.
Yeah.
But, like, who do you, because obviously, like, one of the reasons Alessi spoke so highly of you is you've studied this stuff inside and out. You're not just someone who will argue about points in the Bible without literally being able to pull up point in scripture, note, and the whole bit. But like, in your time studying, let's say, the New Testament and the character that is Jesus, what do you make of that? I mean, he was a historical character. We know he existed, but who do you think he was, and do you think he was, regardless of whether he was divine or not, do you think he was a force of good?
To clarify, I'm very much a student here, and I'm fascinated by the Gospels, and I have read a lot about them, but I would be put to shame by a biblical scholar, like in terms of knowledge, in terms of interpretation. Certainly, like grasp of Greek, I don't read New Testament Greek. I know some important terms and things like that, but I'm very much not even approximating an expert here, which is important to clarify because, you know, I'm sort of trying to learn out loud here. When I share these ideas with people, even if I say them kind of confidently, like, hey, this is what I think Jesus is doing, it's all in the spirit of being like, this is how I'm reading it, guys. Like, am I missing something? And sometimes I am like just missing something, or someone brings something to my attention. I'm like, actually, you know what? You're totally right. I need to totally reevaluate my view. That happens all the time. In my estimation, that throat clearing out of the way, the historical Jesus of Nazareth was a disciple of John the Baptist who was essentially trying to adapt and continue the ministry of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is my favorite New Testament character.
Why is he your favorite?
You know who John the Baptist is?
Yes.
I ask people this all the time, and they say, yeah, of course I do. Who's John the Baptist?
Jesus' cousin.
Who is John the Baptist? Like, what does he do?
He was the dude that did the baptizing.
Yeah, sure. And what does that mean? What is baptizing?
Bringing someone into the belief system. In this case, we're referring to it in a Christian context and being a part of what then became that church.
But Christianity didn't exist yet.
It didn't exist.
So
when
what
he
was Jesus
there.
being baptized into?
I don't know what he was being baptized into officially, actually.
And what does baptism actually mean?
Oh, you're getting meta.
It's like,
remember, I recorded for 5 hours right before you got here. You got to bear with me.
I'm being a bit unfair. Because the point is that people always say, yeah, of course I know who John the Baptist is. Because he's the guy that baptized Jesus. It's like, what does that mean? We don't know. The first time the word baptism shows up is in this report of John the Baptist. Like, who was he? What was he doing? Why was Jesus being baptized? This is really strange.
Yeah.
Why is it that Jesus, God himself, according to Orthodox Christianity, would need to be baptized? Baptized into what? For what purpose? Now, it's unlikely that the gospel authors would make up this story, right? If they're trying to present Jesus as at least the Son of God and possibly God himself, they're not going to make up a story about him being baptized by some other preacher who was
Yeah, because it goes against the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that all of the Gospels report about John the Baptist and his importance mean that we can be pretty certain that historically this is actually what happened, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, right?
Yeah.
So why? Now, the Christian answers are plentiful. There are lots of reasons why that could have happened, but like historically, I believe it's because he was a follower of John the Baptist. We have all kinds of indications that this is the case. Like, at one point, Jesus is asked, or Jesus says, who the greatest person ever born of a woman was. Of people born of a woman, there is none greater than John the Baptist. He refers to John the Baptist as the greatest person who ever lived.
Person.
Yes. So some people think, well, okay, he was excluding himself there. So he might have been. He also might not have been. Like, we don't really know. It's kind of interesting. John the Baptist is a hugely significant figure with his own ministry as well. This is important to point out. He's somebody who's got his own following. Two of Jesus' disciples are John the Baptist's disciples, who essentially poaches from them. And in the canonical...
Oh, he poached them.
Well, yeah, in the canonical tradition, John the Baptist basically is constantly saying, there is coming one greater than I. Like, you're all my followers, but I baptize you with water, but there's one who's going to come and baptize you with spirit, you know.
So when you're a free agent, you're signing with him.
yeah, right, exactly. And so Jesus comes along and John the Baptist is like, here he is, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, as John's gospel has him say. So instantly, John the Baptist is just like, this is the dude. I'm unfit to like untie his sandal. It's a really clunky sort of specific phrase.
Oh, he said that?
Yeah, or maybe it's tie the sandal, something like that. He says like, I'm unworthy. Pull it up, John 1.
I guess that was like the old school way of saying I'm unworthy of holding his jockstrap.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So some people kind of think that was this some kind of known colloquial saying that people say, because it's weirdly specific. So the first person mentioned, if you scroll down, the first person mentioned by name is John the Baptist. Hold on, scroll up a bit. There we go. John testified out concerning him. So the word became flesh, famously in John's gospel. The word becomes flesh and dwells among us, blah, blah, blah. John testified concerning him, that's John the Baptist, saying, this is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given.
For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ.
No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So this is a very high Christology. This is very like Jesus is the guy, you know. And if you look right underneath, John the Baptist denies being the Messiah. They come up to him and they say, who are you? Are you the Messiah? And he says, I'm not the Messiah. He says, are you Elijah? He says, no. He says, are you the prophet? No. And if you scroll up right to the top of John's Gospel, there was a man, this is verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He's not called John the Baptist in John's Gospel, but that's who we're talking about.
Just called John.
He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that all may believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. John's Gospel is particularly interested in reminding us that John is not the Messiah. He's not the light. He came to bear witness to the light. Then they come and ask him, are you the Messiah? He says, I'm not the Messiah. And one indication, or one interesting implication of this, is that at the time of the writing of John's Gospel, which is probably around like 80, 90, 100 AD, there were people who believed that John the Baptist was the Messiah, that John the Baptist was the light, that John the Baptist was the main guy. And that's why in John's Gospel, one idea is that that's why in John's Gospel we see such an emphasis on diminishing the status of John the Baptist. He's constantly saying, like, this guy's better than me, he's coming, I'm unworthy, like, this is the guy, I'm not the Messiah, he's the Messiah. Because we know that John is held in high esteem. Jesus calls him the greatest man that's ever lived. When Herod Antipas first hears rumors of this Jesus chap, when people start talking about Jesus, Herod Antipas says, this is John the Baptist resurrected. Jesus is causing such a scene around throughout his ministry. And when Herod Antipas, the king, hears about this guy, he says it's John the Baptist resurrected. What must John the Baptist have been doing if when this guy hears about Jesus, he goes, oh, it's another John the Baptist?
Well, John was pouring water. This guy's walking on water. He's 2.0.
Yeah, that's right. Water is actually...
I'm going to hell.
But the emphasis on water is really interesting too, because it's not entirely clear what the water thing is all about. James McGrath has just done 2 books. I had him on my show about John the Baptist. One is a popular biography called Christmaker. It's a great Christmaker, because he's the one who makes the Christ, right? And the scholarly work he put out is called John of History, Baptist of Faith. You know, and it's about the historical John the Baptist. And some of it, in my view, gets kind of speculative, but I'd recommend people reading this if they're interested, or read through the Gospels with a view towards John the Baptist being incredibly important, because it's kind of underplayed. People don't realize just how important John the Baptist is. He's the first person mentioned by name in John's Gospel, unless you count the Word as a name, or God, I suppose. And is like denying the messiahship, and there's this preoccupation with it.
So what were all the things he was doing, though? Because, like, as you pointed out at the very beginning, when you asked me my base level knowledge on him, it is emphasis on base. Yeah, well, right?
we're not entirely sure, but we know that one thing he was doing was baptizing people, and he was doing what was called a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah.
So
heard that one at the altar.
Go to Mark 1. So I like looking at Mark's Gospel because it's our earliest Gospel.
When was Mark's Gospel written again?
Arguably around 70 AD. There are all kinds of debates about when the Gospels are written, and it's kind of a fascinating debate.
And was this also written on papyrus, by the way?
Yeah. So we have. The thing is, we don't have the original autographs, as in we don't have the original. We don't have Mark's Gospel written in 70 AD. What we have are like early fragments of copies or early codices, and so we don't know what the original autographs would have looked like. And also, I'm no expert in manuscripts, so there might be some way we could know that without seeing them like ourselves. But the dating of Mark's Gospel is not based on finding a manuscript and like dating the manuscript with carbon dating or something. It's quite speculative. It's very textual. So we do have like early manuscripts, so we can put a top end on these manuscripts, but
nailing it down to an exact point is speculation.
We haven't got like a 1st century fragment, right? And even if we did, it would be probably impossible to like prove exactly when it was written. So instead, we're looking at other factors. So Mark's Gospel seems to be written in response to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. This is like a key moment. Some people think it was written before 70 AD. Some people think it was written in like 40 AD. It's just incredibly speculative. In fact, in a new tab, can you go to John chapter 5? So John's Gospel is the latest Gospel, which people think is written around like 90 AD, maybe 95. But there are some scholars who look...
You said 5.
5,
right?
yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Sorry.
There are some scholars who look at John and say, take a look at verse 2 there. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool. There is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool. That pool would have been destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So the fact
The
that
pool?
yeah, because it was on the temple ground, so the whole area is just like completely flattened, and so it wouldn't exist anymore. In other words, Jerusalem was like ravaged, and so although John is telling a story about what happened a long time ago, at the beginning of John's Gospel, he's writing as an author. He's saying, he doesn't say, now in that time there was a pool, and this is what Jesus did there. He says, now there is a pool
right now,
and this is what happened there. And so some scholars, based on this alone, say that means that John must have been writing his Gospel before 70 AD, which is when the temple was destroyed. Because he says there is. Now, it's possible that the author of John's Gospel was just saying there is because he's sort of writing as if he's in the tense of the time.
Yeah, or he was playing chess, not checkers, like you're going to think I wrote it earlier.
Right. But it is a little bit weird, right? It's like, why is it speaking in the present tense? So some people look at that and go, oh, John must be pre-70. So the point I'm trying to make is that dating is an incredibly speculative enterprise. But it's generally assumed that Mark is the earliest. So if we go back to Mark 1, which is in our other tab, John the Baptist prepares the way. And arche eugelion Jesu Christos or something, and the beginning of the good news, and good news is the same word for gospel, by the way, eugelion. So when you hear about the gospels, it just means the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Son of God kind of should be in brackets because it's not in some of our earliest manuscripts. So oftentimes in translations, you'll see that. In fact, I think if you see where it says B, the little B footnote, some manuscripts do not have the Son of God. These are fascinating. If you're ever reading the Bible online, is this the NIV? Yeah, look at the footnotes because it's always got these really interesting little tidbits. But check it out. You've got this interesting quote of actually a few different prophets, but it mentions Isaiah. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way, a voice calling in the wilderness, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And then John the Baptist appears in the wilderness, and he's preparing the way for Jesus. So Jesus in this instance is the Lord.
Yes.
And in the Old Testament passage, the Lord there is Yahweh, the great God. So it seems like Mark is presenting Jesus as Yahweh. But notice again, the second person mentioned by name in John's Gospel, John the Baptist, in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. What does that mean? I don't know. No one really knows. But look,
preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
The whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went out to him, confessing their sins. They were baptized by him in the river Jordan.
To get forgiven.
Yes. John was wearing clothing made of camel's hair, a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts and wild honey.
That sounds awful.
And then there it is again. And this was his message. After me comes one more powerful than I, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. So from our earliest source, we've got John the Baptist as an incredibly important person, the first person mentioned, who prepares the way for Jesus, emphasizes that Jesus is more important than he is, but also an emphasis on how big John the Baptist was. Everyone's coming out to him for the forgiveness of sins. Interestingly, later in Jesus' ministry, Jesus says things like, the greatest student will one day come to be as good as their teacher and surpass their teacher. He also says to his disciples at one point, you will do even greater things than I, which is a little bit of a weird thing to say. So,
as the Son of Man.
Again, historically, I'm kind of looking at this and thinking, what's going on here? I kind of see this as John the Baptist, passing on his ministry to Jesus. Jesus is essentially his successor, and then Jesus takes on this forgiveness of sins, and this sort of embodiment of what Christians will say, only God can forgive sins, and that's why Jesus can forgive sins. What the hell is going on with John the Baptist then? And why is it that in John, if you go to John chapter 20, verse 21, sorry, this is a lot of
but he was close to him,
jumping around.
And they were related. And
21 to 22.
And
well, just chapter 20 is fine. Yeah, you can scroll down.
Hypothetically, this is way more serious than it. But I'm thinking about good things that come before great things. Mm-hmm. Right? Like one person walks so another can run.
Yeah. So this is the thing, right? Historically, you're either looking at this theologically and saying okay, well, John the Baptist was an important preacher, a prophet of God who knew that Jesus was God himself, he was incarnate, so that's why he was there. Or you could see it historically as someone who's just saying that this man will This man will come who will like overtake my ministry. Now, historically, if that is what happened, it probably doesn't make much sense that John was saying that before Jesus showed up.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we take this view that Jesus is essentially a disciple of John the Baptist who carries on his ministry, it's unlikely that John the Baptist is already going around saying, there's one who's coming who's going to be greater than I am. And then Jesus appears and he goes, that's him, that's the guy. You know, that's unlikely to have happened. John chapter 20, so one chapter beforehand. This is a really important Christological moment for me. If you scroll down to like verse 21, a bit further, about there. Yeah, okay.
This indexed, man.
Jesus
Holy
is talking
shit.
to his disciples here, and he says, again, Jesus said, this is him speaking to his disciples. And he does this is after the resurrection. So Jesus has died, he's resurrected, and he says, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. The word as there is kathos, which means in the same way as. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. So Jesus seems to be giving his disciples the ability to forgive sins. So my image of who Jesus is somebody who kind of takes on the ministry of John the Baptist, becomes extremely proficient, is an incredibly talented like healer, miracle worker, all of this kind of stuff, and then has a view constantly towards then passing that on to his disciples. And this forgiveness of sins is really important because it shows up in John the Baptist. Jesus takes it on, and now he's giving it to his disciples. Also, notice how this is worded. I'm only really thinking about this now, like this particular point, but it says, how does he give that power to his disciples? Receive the Holy Spirit. He like gives them the Holy Spirit, and now they can forgive people's sins. Go back to Mark chapter 1, top left tab. Let's look at the actual baptism itself. Check this out. So, actually, I don't think it will word it like this in Mark's gospel. Hold on. Yeah, okay. So it kind of does here, right? So this is the actual baptism. Just as Jesus was coming, so Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. A voice came out of heaven, you are my son, with whom I love. With you I am very well pleased. Try like Luke chapter 3, I think it would be. Because the thing about the Gospels is because we've got 4 Gospels, the same stories are often reported in multiple ways throughout all of the Gospels. So look, it's basically identical, right?
Verses like rap bars, bro.
It's basically identical, right? Like you can see it's the same thing, the same quote, although it's slightly
Which
changed.
verse am I looking at?
So scroll down a bit. Let's get to the actual. Scroll down a bit further. There we go. Hold on.
Oh, look at that. All right. When all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was open and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased.
So this is really important. The Holy Spirit descends on him in bodily form like a dove. Try the same thing in Matthew's gospel. Let's do like Matthew baptism and see what comes up. The main thing that I want you to take notice of here is in every instance of the baptism of Jesus, the Holy Spirit comes upon Jesus.
As a dove.
Yes. The Spirit of God descending on him like a dove
And
alighting on him. And I think in at least one instance, there's talk of like the Holy Spirit coming like into him. I'm not sure if that's in the Greek in the Synoptics or if it's John's gospel.
The wording's also the same on that quote, almost word for word.
Yeah, so the thing about the so you know that the first 3 gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. Have you heard this before?
I think Wes talked about this.
Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke share so much in common that they seem to share similar sources and rely upon each other. John's gospel is just like totally wacky and out on its own.
Maybe they were cheating off each other's papers.
That's how I mean, like 95% or so of Mark's gospel is also in Luke and Matthew. Like Luke and Matthew are essentially like expanded versions of Mark's gospel with like new stuff added on. Only a couple.
How
of
wild would that be if they were just like sitting in some room, like inside a rock in Jerusalem, like, yeah, we're gonna write this out, and then it becomes those gospels.
That is basically how it. Yeah, how it seems to be.
We're going to change the world.
We know that the author of Matthew and Luke are using Mark, which, by the way, is one of the dating, the keys to dating here is that, like, if we date Mark around 70, then because Matthew and Luke are obviously using Mark as a source, we have to date them, like, you know, at least sort of maybe 5-10 years afterwards,
Ballpark.
right? And so there's a lot of stuff going on there. At any rate, the point is that at the baptism, by John the Baptist, the Spirit comes upon or into Jesus. At the end of John's Gospel, Jesus gives his, the authority to forgive sins to his disciples by breathing, and the Spirit comes upon them. So there seem to be these interesting parallels between what Jesus gets from John the Baptist and what the disciples get from Jesus at the right moment.
Is Jesus getting that from John the Baptist, or is it a result of just him? Like John the Baptist happens to be performing this act on him, baptizing him, and then afterwards, separately from John the Baptist, Jesus' Father, God, sends the Holy Spirit upon him.
This is what the Bible says
teaches
happens, right? Because again, I'm trying to offer a plausible account of what it would mean historically for Jesus to have just been a follower of John the Baptist. But as I clarified, this is just one man's opinion.
Sure.
The Bible paints it very differently, and Christians believe something very different. They believe that John is doing some kind of baptism. Jesus comes up to him, and John's like, "I'm unworthy of this." But he baptizes him, at which point the heavens open and the Father says, announces, "This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased." And so the Father is the one who puts the Spirit into Jesus. The Father is there. The Trinity is present. You've got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit descending like a dove. You've also got the physicality of the dove, which is a little bit strange. And so Christians are going to listen to what I'm saying and saying, no, it's totally, totally different. And also, it's not that Jesus got this from John the Baptist. He got it from the Father, which is kind of interesting. Of course, Jesus says in John chapter 20, "As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you." So even if it was the Father who sent Jesus, Jesus is now sending his disciples in the same way. So if that's where Jesus got his ability to forgive sins from, for example, then he's passing that on to his disciples still. But I do find it a little bit suspicious that John is teaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. What does that mean? Christians will say, well, John wasn't forgiving people's sins. He was baptizing people for the forgiveness of their sins somehow or another. It wasn't like he didn't have the authority to forgive their sins. He was kind of just announcing the forgiveness of sins, as priests often did. So priests would announce that people's sins are forgiven, but they would never claim to forgive sins themselves, because that's what God does. But they would say, your sins are forgiven, by which they mean God has forgiven you. A bit like what a Catholic priest does when you go to confession. And so Christians will probably look at John the Baptist and say that's what he was doing there. And Jesus comes along and forgives of his own authority, and that's what makes him God. That's a bit dubious too, because that's also a little bit unclear. There's an episode in Mark chapter 2, heard about the paralytic being raised, being sort of sent through the roof to Jesus, because the crowds are so big, and there's a paralytic man who wants to be healed, and they lower him through the roof. And Jesus says to him, "Take heart, your sins are forgiven." And the scribes nearby, the Jewish authorities, they're thinking, hold on a second, who can forgive sins but God alone? Only God can forgive sins. But Jesus is announcing this forgiveness of sins. What's he doing? Jesus reads their minds, knows that they're thinking this, and says, "Why are you thinking these things?" He says, because they accuse him of blasphemy, in their hearts. And he says, why are you saying this? I want you to know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins on earth. And he says, which is easier, to say to this man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your mat and walk? So that you know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, I tell you, get up and walk. And the paralytic man gets up and he walks out. So Jesus is saying, okay, you're saying I can't forgive sins?
Mic drop.
It's even harder to raise a paralytic, right? But watch this. So raise a paralytic, so you know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins as well. Now, this is a really important chapter, because Christians look at this often and they'll say, okay, so the scribes say, who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus goes, well, watch this. I can forgive sins. So he's claiming to be God. Because only God can forgive sins. And Jesus is saying that I have the authority to forgive sins. That's how Christians interpret it.
But you don't think that's the case?
Another interpretation is to say, is to say, Jesus says that, actually, can you pull up Matthew's version of this? I forget which chapter it's in, but Matthew paralytic, type in. And
type in paralyzed guy. I feel like that might come up faster.
Yeah, but let's get Matthew's version. So Matthew's version is slightly different. This is really interesting, and a lot of Christians might not be aware of this too, because, by the way, this comes up all the time as an apologetical tool. In popular apologetics, people like the Connectleys and Wes Huff, and people, I think they use this kind of argument all the time, and they point to Mark chapter 2, Jesus forgives sins, therefore, he is claiming to be God. Some interesting things when we get to Matthew's gospel. So my interpretation of this story is the scribes are saying, who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus is saying, you're wrong. I want you to know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins. Even if because he's got that from the Father, even if like God has given him that authority, I think he's trying to say, actually, I have the authority to do that too, and I'll prove it. Watch this. And some interesting clues to this in Matthew's Gospel include, check it out, verse 3. At this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, this fellow is blaspheming.
Said to themselves, yeah.
So he's reading, knowing their thoughts here. It's pretty creepy. Mark's version says, this fellow is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Interestingly, Matthew, by the way, remember I said a moment ago that Matthew takes almost all of Mark's Gospel. 95% of what's in Mark's Gospel, Matthew has in his Gospel almost verbatim.
Yeah.
Interestingly, one of the few changes that Matthew makes is here. In Mark's Gospel, it says, this fellow is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Matthew removes the reference to only God being able to forgive sins, which is kind of interesting. Not entirely sure why he did that. But the implication is still there, because they say he's blaspheming. How else could he be blaspheming except somehow, invoking something that only God can do? So I don't think that Matthew's trying to remove that implication, but it is interesting that he just chose to remove that statement. That's kind of weird, right? But then, check it out. So, and keep these two interpretations in mind. Either Jesus is saying, yes, you're right, and I am God, so I'm going to forgive sins. Or he's saying, no, you're wrong, I can forgive sins as well, even though I'm not God. So Matthew reports this story. Which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. So he says to the paralyzed man, get up, take your mat, and go home. The man got up and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe. They praised God, who had given such authority to a man.
A man.
A man. That is unique to Matthew's
Who had given
version of the
such
story.
authority to man.
To man,
Yeah.
to man. As in to mankind.
Yes.
So at least the author of Matthew here is painting the interpretation of the crowds as thinking that God has given the authority to forgive sins to a man.
Well, to play devil's advocate here, because he is in the appearance of a man walking among them.
So Christians will read this and say, well, yeah, that's because they were like, because they hadn't clocked it yet.
Yeah.
They were sort of like, hold on, why would God give this authority to a man? That's so strange, because they hadn't realized that it's because Jesus is actually God. But my reading of this story is at least consistent, right? Like, as in my view that what Jesus is doing here is saying, by the way, one of the themes of the Gospels is that scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, they come to Jesus and they say, you're blaspheming. And he goes, no, you've misunderstood me. And they say, you're claiming this. And there's like, no, that's not what I'm doing. At one point, they accuse him of being a Samaritan possessed by a demon. That happens in John chapter 8. And they're just getting things wrong left, right, and center.
They said Jesus was a demon.
Yeah, they say that on a few occasions. In Mark's Gospel, in the Synoptic, so Mark's Gospel happens quite early. There's so much in here, man.
I'm loving this. This is great.
They say, type in, I can't remember which chapter this is. It might be Mark 3, but type in Mark, blasphemy, Holy Spirit. So, Jesus' whole thing is about forgiveness, right? It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter where you've come from. If you throw yourself on Christ and you accept and you repent, then you'll be forgiven of your sins. Check this out. So the scribes come to Jerusalem and they say he's possessed by Beelzebub, and by
Beelzebul?
Beelzebub. Beelzebul. And by the prince of demons he casts out demons. So Jesus is exorcising people, exorcising.
Yeah.
Casting out demons. And the Jewish scribes say, well, he's doing that because he's a demon himself. That's how he's communicating with these demons, And so Jesus has this whole thing where he says, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom can't stand, blah, 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 blah. So he's basically saying, like, no, he says, but no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. So you have to bind the demon to win over the demon.
Yes.
So he can't be a demon himself. And then he says, truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin.
So you can't ever get for just that.
Mm-hmm. So
meaning you can blaspheme against him.
You can blaspheme against him.
You can blaspheme against God.
You can blaspheme against God or the Father.
This Holy Spirit.
But if you blaspheme against the Holy Spirit, you will not be forgiven.
Right.
What the hell does that mean? Once again, I'm going to surprise you here. Nobody really knows. Nobody knows for sure what Jesus meant by those words.
You can't know everything.
No. But
That
so
he
it's kind of interesting that this happens in the context of him being accused of having a demon within him.
Yeah.
So it seems, so some people say, well, this is because specifically the scribes saw the evidence right in front of them and they called God himself a demon. And that is the kind of thing that simply can't be forgiven, or something like that. Some people say that to blaspheme the Holy Spirit is to sort of know that it's true, but still reject it, because you're like rejecting the Spirit. But the fact that it says it will never be forgiven is what keeps me up at night. Because whatever interpretation you give, and I've spoken to Christians about this, left, right, and center, and I've never had a satisfying answer. That's not to say there isn't one, but I haven't spoken about it like maybe with the right people. But they'll have some line on this.
What?
They'll say, like, when I spoke to the Connectleys about it, they say, like, look, this is because somebody who blasphemes the Holy Spirit means that they've hardened their heart against, like, the truth. And they've done that to such an extent that even when the truth is there and it's in them, they still just won't hear it. And that is the kind of, if you don't have a heart that's open to forgiveness, then you can never be forgiven.
But what if I'm like, what if I'm just kind of living a shit life, right?
Yeah.
Let's paint a scenario here.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, you know, for whatever reason, I don't know why this would come up, but this comes up and you're like, oh, you know, fuck that or whatever.
Yeah.
And then 5 years
And
later,
then 5 years later, you're like, actually, I changed
with
my
a
mind.
wife and a kid, and
Exactly.
you change your life. And like, you know, some other guy's out there killing someone and saying, sorry, God, and he's good, but you're not. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't make any sense.
So this is the thing, right? Like, whatever line you have on what blasphemy of the Holy Spirit means, because it says it will never be forgiven, you have to imagine that no matter what your line is there, if tomorrow I change my mind about that I cannot be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
So the Connectleys said that the reason that's the case is because the person who's so hard in their heart has made it such that they just never will change their mind. That's what it means.
I think that's a bullshit answer.
I think so too.
Yeah.
With all due
Sorry,
respect to
Stu.
them.
It's Stu, right? Is that right? Stuart Connect?
Cliff and Stuart, that's right. You know, and we had a great conversation for like 3 hours on this. And because it's a podcast format and not a debate, I can't press this too hard. But I really was trying to say to them, like, but I don't think you're hearing what I'm saying here. Is that like, this means that there is no hope for this person. It does not matter what they do. They will never be forgiven for this, right? And I think that, you know, Christians recognize the importance of this verse, but they have like oftentimes, and I mean like in popular apologetics, they have their apologetical line, oh, that's because, you know, to blaspheme the Holy Spirit means to like harden your heart to forgiveness. And you can't be forgiven if you're not open to forgiveness. And I'm like, that's true of any sin ever. You can't be forgiven for committing a murder while you're committing it. You can't be forgiven for having a hardened heart while your heart is hardened. But the point about forgiveness is that it's retrospective. It happens afterwards. So whatever blaspheming the Holy Spirit is, it has to be something which, whatever you've done, if in 5 years from now you say, I regret that, I shouldn't have done that, God, please accept my apology, that God has to say, no, you will never be forgiven.
Yeah, see, this is where it doesn't line up for me, because it's like, on the one hand, you have Jesus, and I'm looking at it from the Christian perspective now, painted as divine, not human, and perfect.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have scripture that you hold to and say, well, this is the historical record, and we know this is right, that also shows him as, and I'm not even blaming him, as someone who can once in a while, in very slight ways, I might add, usually, be imperfect, right? He may be imperfect by, I don't know, exaggerating right here, if this is what he said. That's one example. He also may be imperfect, like we had Captain Tazariak in here. You ever seen him?
No.
You never seen Captain
No,
T?
who's he?
I need him in a studio with fucking Captain T. That would popcorn ready. He's the leader of the New York Black Hebrew Israelites.
Oh,
That's
right.
We had a great conversation.
Man, you had him in here.
Yeah, episode 270. We talked for over 3 hours, and I will say, like, even Alessi was
Wow.
impressed with his ability to remember stuff from the
Yeah,
Bible,
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
like you, because I can't repeat it because there was a racial epithet that he's allowed to say that I'm not allowed to say in the phrase. But at one point he's like, oh yeah, Jesus was switching the word there. And we start cracking up. And I'm like, what do you mean he was switching? He goes, he saw them in the temple working and he brought in a switch. He started hitting them.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, even Alessi was like, no, he didn't. And then we pull it up.
yeah, John's
and we're
gospel.
like, oh fuck, Jesus was like that.
He made
you know
a
what
cord.
I mean?
He made a cord.
Yeah, a cord.
And was driving people out of the temple.
And that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, hitting guys with a
Yes.
cord to get them out of the temple.
Yes.
doesn't sound like the most moral way to go
Well, there you go.
right? But at the same time, like, I kind of fuck with that because that makes him, people are going to say this is blasphemy saying this, but it makes him like a human figure, even if he wasn't.
No, it's not blasphemy because Jesus in Orthodox Christianity, and I don't mean like Eastern
I got to be
Orthodox.
careful with the,
I know it's important how you'll get
all respect,
how you'll get clipped, but what matters is the soul of what you're saying. And in the Orthodox tradition, by which I mean like orthodoxy, not like the Eastern Orthodox Church. I mean like Catholic, Protestant, as opposed to like Gnosticism or whatever.
Yeah.
Jesus is fully God and fully man. It's one of the paradoxes at the heart of Christianity is that he's 100% man and 100% divine. So if you downplay his humanity, if you say, oh, he wasn't really a human, he was God who just appeared to be a human, that's a heresy. Cool.
Yeah, this part always confuses me too because it's like they make him sound like if I put my hand through him, it would go through like he's a ghost.
Yeah, no, that's a heresy. It's called docetism. I think I actually don't know how to pronounce that very well.
But like, which is it?
Comes
you know
from like
what I mean?
doseo, I think, which is Greek for appearance or to seem. And so the idea is that like Jesus only appeared to be a human being. But yeah, it's kind of got this vibe of like, well, if I touched him, he'd be like a ghost. But that's a heresy. No, he was a human of flesh and blood. Interestingly, a lot of the Gnostic Gospels present Jesus as this sort of God, like in the form of a human, but not really a human. That's how the Gospel of Judas appears to present Jesus. It's absolutely fascinating. But I mean, translation. You mentioned before. You were like, a lot of this is about translation. The things that I'm bringing up here, I think. I always try to be careful to like really get at the Greek terms and see what they actually mean. There are some instances where I think like the gospel stories have been misreported, so that like even if you look at the Greek, I'm thinking it's probably gotten something wrong. But
Do you
there
have
are
an example?
So the most famous examples of things that probably are in the gospels but probably just didn't happen. Called like an interpolation, so something which is added in later. The most famous examples of these are the ending of Mark's Gospel, and there's a verse in John's Gospel, both of which don't appear in our earliest manuscripts, and so they seem to be a later addition. In fact, once again, sorry, you're doing the hard work here. If you scroll up a little bit, see the drop down where it says Bible book list.
Yes.
You can click on that, and this is the whole Gospel. Right, scroll down on Mark, right the way down to Mark 16. So this is the last chapter of Mark. I wonder how the ESV says it. So see there, it says the brackets at in the middle there. It says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 to 20. See that?
Right here, yeah.
It's because the original manuscripts. So our earliest complete manuscripts of the Bible are Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, and they're like 4th century, and they just end on. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's where they end. Now, Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus is predicted. So it says, go and you'll see him in Jerusalem and he's going to be there. But all the stuff that happens afterwards, which is like the actual appearances, they're not in there. So it's just widely accepted by most scholars that the rest of the gospel underneath that, the so-called long ending of Mark, is a later interpolation. So that's not like a translation issue from the Greek into English. That's just a thing about the manuscript, which says that something has been added in.
Like Hollywood got involved.
Yeah, there are some scholars who think that the long ending of Mark might have been original, and for some other reason it wasn't in the scripture. Actually, Wes Huff did a video about that a while back. And
what did he say?
It's all a bit dramatic. So there's a guy I know. Oh boy, this is a story. Guy I know called Gnostic Informant on YouTube.
I know him as well.
Yeah, cool, right? So he's on the Danny Jones show, and he said exactly what I've just said about Mark's Gospel. He tells Danny Jones exactly what I've just said. Wes Huff made a response video like on Instagram, and said, "So this is partly true, but mostly false." And he basically goes in to debunk the claim. So the first thing Wes Huff says is like,
Hey guys, I just want to make something very clear about this next part you're about to see. So this episode is being released on YouTube on a Tuesday. It was recorded last Wednesday, so 6 days before this, and it was released early on Patreon on Saturday night. I say that because Alex is about to address some points that Wes Huff made in a previous video that he then deleted because there were mistakes in it. And there was then, after Alex and I recorded, Wes actually put out a video on Sunday night, so 2 days before this video, where he addressed this topic again. So I want to make sure that people understand that Alex had no time to respond to any of that stuff because this was recorded before that video was put out. So if there's any new information that Wes put in there, I don't know if there is, I haven't seen the video, Alex will respond to that at a later point, and he was working with what Wes had said publicly when Alex and I were actually recording this. I know that's a lot, but let's get back to it.
The resurrection is still narrated because, like I just said, it still says, go ahead and he'll be there in Galilee. That is something that Gnostic Informant said on the show. So, okay, but Wes is just working off like an Instagram reel, so he doesn't know that. But then Wes says, it is true that our earliest manuscripts don't contain the long ending of Mark, but there's a really interesting feature about them. And maybe you can pull this up, actually, Alessi. If you type in, maybe it'll come up if you type in, Codex Vaticanus Mark 16. And then type in Mark 16 after it. And maybe just see if there's maybe just click on that, see if there's a scroll down. So, okay, pull up this image.
Reddit thread for a minute.
See that image there? So this is a picture of Codex Vaticanus, which again is one of our earliest biblical manuscripts. And this is the ending of Mark. And it ends by saying they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And there's nothing else there. The sort of light text that you can see underneath is from the other side of the page, right? So this is a blank document. So Wes Huff, in response to Gnostic Informant, says, but there is an interesting feature. There is an interesting feature of Mark's Gospel, which we only see in Mark's Gospel, which is that in Codex Vaticanus and in Codex Sinaiticus, it does have the short ending of Mark, but there's this big intentional gap that's left at the end of Mark's Gospel. Right? Now, why would they leave a huge gap at the end? Well, because they knew that there was more material. They just didn't include it for whatever reason, but they left this gap so that other scholars could come and correct that decision if they decided they needed to. You know what I mean?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Other scholars, though.
Yeah.
So
Mark said. So Wes Huff says, look, in Mark's Gospel, can you go back to the other image? So in Mark's Gospel, we've got this big gap at the end, and he says, and this is a feature that's unique to Mark's Gospel. Crucially, we don't see this in any other Gospels. That's what he says in the video. Now, okay, that's a pretty good explanation, right? It's like, okay, yeah, sure, there is a missing long ending of Mark, but because he's left this big intentional gap, we know that he at least knew that it existed. So it wasn't something that was just made up later. It still existed at the time. He just didn't include it in this codex for whatever reason, but he knew it existed because he left the big gap.
But if they, I actually do want to go into this. What I was thinking, maybe I'm overthinking this. But if they leave it blank for other scholars to come in later, you are now letting more time pass and letting people come in who did not necessarily live at the same time as that witness.
But check this out, right? So this none of this actually matters because the point that Wes Huff makes, as he says in this video, it does end abruptly and doesn't have the long ending, but it leaves a big gap, which indicates that the author knew there was extra material. And crucially, this is not a feature we see in any other Gospels. Okay. Here's the problem with that. This is Codex Vaticanus. If you were to look at the end of... Actually, let's just look it up. Type in Vaticanus, ending of Luke's Gospel, maybe. Try that. Or just go Codex Vaticanus, just see if there's an online version. Yeah, let's scroll down. Can you just read it online somewhere?
Luke's Gospel?
You kind of need to actually see the actual manuscript itself. So yeah, type in. You don't want to. Oh yeah, facsimile. They'll do the trick. Let's see here. Yeah, nice. Okay, so let's see if this loads.
Come on.
I'm gonna refresh that. Okay, so this is Codex Vaticanus. Nice. Now, is there like a contents page? Can we get to Luke's Gospel?
You seen anything?
Bookmarks?
No, this is a little bit.
Come on. Because this is all in ancient Greek.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Can we cut?
Yeah, you want to pause for a minute?
I want to find it. I want to show you this because this is a really interesting
We'll be
story.
right back. All right, we're back. So we were able to find the content.
Yeah. So what I've done is instead of pulling up because Gnostic Informant has made a video about this. It's called like Wes Huff is lying, like they accused Billy Carson. He's pretty annoyed. I understand why he's angry about this, by the way, and I think you will. I think you will too. But no, but seriously, like I can understand why this was like this is really quite bad. It's got all the information together, so instead of clicking back and forth, we'll just look at the video that they made. But we should play it on mute.
Right. So Wes's video has a copyright song in the background, so I can't play it. But we want to make sure we have the context.
If you hit play on mute, just because I want to show you what Wes actually says here when it goes back. So check it out. Earliest copies that leave out the longer ending of Mark have an unusual feature. The copies of these earliest manuscripts leave deliberate blank sections. Pause.
A feature
that we don't go back.
All right, go back about 5
I got to read this.
You want me to read it in his voice?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah. So he's talking here about the versions of the early manuscripts which don't have the long ending of Mark's gospel. So pop it back.
Okay.
Best Wes Huff impression.
Okay. Here we go. The copies of these earliest manuscripts leave deliberate blank sections, a feature we don't find the end of the other gospels.
So pause.
This is an indication.
Oh yeah, carry on. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
This is an indication that the scribes appear to have been aware of
the material.
It's going to.
So check it out. Right. So pay attention to what he said there, which is there's an interesting feature, which is that these earliest versions of Mark, missing the long ending, have an unusual feature. They leave a deliberate gap at the end, something that we don't see at the end of other Gospels. And he shows on screen. See, there's 3 on screen here.
Yes.
It's Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Alexandrinus, I think is how you would say it. Three versions, and as you can see, he's highlighted in a big yellow box the gap where the long ending would go. Okay, so we all clear on what the argument is here. This is probably about to semi-blow your mind, but check this out. Okay, so hit play.
Try me.
So it cuts now to Gnostic informant, who's basically saying, this is a Billy Carson level bull crap lie. So he's saying that they're aware of extra material. Check this out, ladies and gentlemen. Buckle your seatbelts. It's about to get wacky.
Evidence exists, he says. That was a Billy Carson level
bull crap lie.
And it's funny. The funny part about
it
is he's
skip forward a little bit.
The Codex Sinaiticus right now.
And you can do this.
According to the Sinai Bible.
Okay, so you can mute this again.
Do you mind if I ask a clarifying question?
You can mute this now. Just skip forward with the arrows. So check this out. Keep going. One more time. Right, so check this out, right? So, as we established, he thinks that there's a gap at the end of the Mark and Codex Sinaiticus, for example, because they knew that there was extra materials. And crucially, this is something that we do not see at the end of other Gospels. Go back 1 arrow and hit play.
Opinion that I disagree with. This is an objective statement.
Check it out.
That you can go and
Codex
check for
Sinaiticus,
yourself.
Book of Acts.
Here on the screen right now.
There's a
Here
gap.
is the Codex Sinaiticus of the Acts.
Check it out.
Matthew,
Luke's Gospel, Matthew's Gospel, Mark's Gospel, John's Gospel.
Revelation.
Pause on, go back and pause on John.
All of them have a...
There's a lot going on here.
You can put it on mute. Put it on mute, but go back.
This one right here?
No, as in the video. Just go back an arrow or two, but mute the video.
Okay.
And hit play, and then so you can see that's the Book of Acts. That's the Book of Luke. Pause around about now. Play a tiny bit more. Pause now.
Right there.
Oh my gosh, so fast. All right.
Yeah, that's because he's sort of lining it up to what he said. So, ready
Oh, he was timing it.
now.
Yeah.
There you go. So check this out, right? So he's showing in Codex Sinaiticus, which remember what has just been said, right? Wes Huff has said that, well, the interesting thing about Mark's Gospel is where they have the short ending, they leave an intentional gap because they know there's extra material. At the end of Acts, Luke, Revelation, John, look at John here, same Codex, Codex Sinaiticus. Look at that massive gap. So hold on a second. What does Wes mean when he says this is not a feature we see at the end of other Gospels? Are there supposed to be a bunch of missing material from John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel too? I don't think so. So Wes has obviously made a mistake including Codex Sinaiticus, right? Because they all leave a gap at the end. It's probably, is it that there's extra material, or is it just that they've got to the end of the book and want to start on a new page? Is that a better explanation? So he's messed up with Codex Sinaiticus, but he showed 3 on screen, right? So keep playing, again on mute. So the other one was Codex Vaticanus. So this is the end of, you can skip forward a tiny little bit. Codex Vaticanus, there you go.
Right there.
Same thing, Corinthians, Acts, Revelation, John's Gospel, all of them, once again, have gaps at the end of them. So Wes Huff has said that the only reason why Mark's Gospel has a gap at the end of it is because they knew the long ending existed. But all of the Gospels in that same codex have gaps at the end of it.
So you think it's cherry picking, obviously.
It's not just cherry picking. It's just like getting it flatly wrong. It's
Yeah.
saying that, well, we know that they knew of the existence of the long ending of Mark because the scribes left a gap to include that long ending of Mark. And this is a feature. Remember, he said this is a feature that we don't see at the end of any other Gospels. You can look up these codexes online and read them. It's like he just didn't even check. Like, there's a gap at the end of every single Gospel. Pretty bad, right?
I agree, and I think.
But you know what? It's about to get worse.
Before you tell you how it's going to get worse,
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is an unfortunate part of the internet that Wes is going to fall victim to and other guys fall victim to when you're in this response era where you're constantly having to respond because you can't have one thing wrong about your belief system because it could threaten the whole dominoes.
As Wes said on your show, sat in this self-same chair that I'm in right now, what is Wes Huff's PhD in? Do you remember? Paratextual features of New Testament manuscripts.
I don't even remember.
Paratextual features. Paratextual features of New Testament manuscripts, meaning like features of New Testament Greek manuscripts that are paratextual. So not about the content of the text, but stuff to do with the way that the manuscripts are written. You know, like the handwriting, the layout, this kind of stuff. So in other words, this kind of stuff. Like, this is squarely within his expertise.
Yes.
Paratextual features of New Testament documents. And yet he's managed to make a genuinely, to me, unfathomable blunder. I do not understand how you can make a video where you say that there's a gap at the end of Mark's Gospel in Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and that's something we don't see in any of the other Gospels. If you have copies of those codexes and you can look and see that there are gaps at the end of every single one of them, I do not understand how you make that blunder. I genuinely don't get it.
Yeah, it seems like a big mistake.
But it's about to get worse.
How?
I'll show you how. Maybe try going forward a little bit, because I'm not sure if they show it on screen again. So pause, check it out. So this is Wes's video. Also, like, take note of the comments here, right? Like, this is just another feeble and weak attempt to make the Bible seem like it's a tool. So people are coming after Gnostic Informant for this. I don't know how many views this had, but you can see it's got nearly 4,000 likes, 4,200 or 700 likes. So it must have a fair amount of views. Everyone's coming after Gnostic Informant. In the video, as you can see, Wes has shown 3 manuscripts which have the gap, and the gap is supposed to indicate that although there's a short ending, we know that there was a longer ending too. I hope you're strapped in, ladies and gentlemen, because check this out, right? So Wes has shown these on screen and helpfully added a yellow box around the gap. The bottom 2, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Yeah, they have the short ending and a gap, but so do the rest of the Gospels. The one on the top there, Codex Alexandrinus, is from the 5th century, and look at me when I say this, has the long ending of Mark. That codex has the long ending. The photo that is on screen right now at the top there is the long ending of Mark with a gap after it. So Wes Huff has said that yes, the earliest manuscripts only have the short ending of Mark, but they've left a gap to indicate they knew there was a long ending of Mark. He has shown on screen a manuscript with the long ending of Mark and then highlighted a gap after the long ending of Mark in order to prove that there are only gaps when they know that there is a missing long ending of Mark.
Doesn't make sense.
Not only that, but even on the ones that do have the short ending of Mark, where he said, okay, well, there's a gap after those, there's also a gap after every single other gospel in those codexes. I don't know what to say.
Has he addressed this?
No. As far as I know, he deleted the video because Gnostic Informant is obviously pretty annoyed about this, and it's just like down the memory hole. No correction, no apology to Gnostic Informant, as far as I'm aware. This just disappeared. And so obviously,
there should be.
Gnostic Informant still has the video, right? And so he can show it like this. And as you can see in this video, Wes Huff is lying. This is on MythVision's channel if you want to go and watch the whole conversation. The thing is, this is like buried within a 2-hour podcast, so not a lot of people saw that this happened. And like, you can see now when Gnostic Informant is there saying like, this is a Billy Carson level bullcrap lie. It's like, yeah, And I can understand why he's so annoyed, because all of these thousands of people are coming after Gnostic informants saying, oh, yeah, see, they never know what they're talking about. This Gnostic informant guy, oh, he doesn't know that, yeah, sure,
right.
there's, because there's a, okay, there's a long ending, but they left a gap, you fool. You didn't know that in paratextual, like Greek, if you do paratextual manuscript tradition, like you'll know that they leave gaps when there's extra material. And they're all coming after Gnostic informant. And Wes has just made like an unfathomable blunder. Now, like you say, it is really important to point out that people just make mistakes all the time. I've probably made about 15 mistakes during this video. I've said the wrong date, I've said the wrong thing, I've quoted the wrong thing, I've mispronounced Alexandrinus or Alexandrinus. Fine, yeah, you can do that. You can make mistakes like that. But this, firstly, I don't understand how it happened. I just don't get how you do this, especially if you're making a graphic. There's a yellow box. Maybe he doesn't make his own graphics, but like there is a yellow box. There is a yellow box highlighting a gap after the long ending of Mark. I'm hoping that people listening are following what I'm saying here and understand that this is like this is like I kind of couldn't believe it when I first saw it. But yeah, I mean, and by the way, also there may be some explanation for this. Like maybe I'm like massively misreading something, and so is Gnostic informant. Like maybe, I don't know. Like I don't want to say with too much confidence that like this is.
It seems like it's a very clear mistake.
It's just like it's such a big mistake, especially if your PhD is in paratextual features of New Testament manuscripts. I don't understand how this happens. And the worst part for me is that all of these comments are coming after Gnostic informant. And now it means that because this video just doesn't exist anymore, because Wes Huff took it down.
That's the shitty part about the internet.
Wes Huff took it down, that like if someone sees Gnostic informant, they might be like, oh, I saw that guy. Oh, I saw that guy. Yeah, there's that video that Wes Huff like destroyed this guy, and that's why he's looking at the Billy Carson thing and going like, yeah, that's like a bad look for Billy Carson. But if somebody had pulled this, if Wes Huff had done this in a debate, in like a Billy Carson type situation, imagine if we were on this podcast right now, Wes Huff is there and he's made this exact argument, and I said to him, well, take a look at the other Gospels. They've all got gaps after them too. Also, the one that you've just shown includes the long ending of Mark. That would be a Billy Carson moment for him.
Yeah,
it really would. And so I can understand why Gnostic informant is so annoyed. Anyway, I don't so much like to sort of stir the pot here, but I sort of said I was making a response to Wes Huff, and it all kind of kicked off, and people were commenting, and I was going to make a response video. And I did part 1, which was about the Isaiah scroll, and I was going to do part 2, where I was going to talk about all of this. And I spoke to Gnostic informant, and I was like, look, man, I think this needs to come to light, because I think it's not fair that this happened to you and nobody like knows. But it's been so long now that I felt like if I came out and made a video just pulling this up, it would have just seemed like out of nowhere. It would have seemed like I was just taking a jab for the sake of it. And so I kind of haven't, but I'm kind of glad we've had the opportunity to talk about it now, because I really want people to be aware that this happened. But I kind of don't want to just like randomly take a jab.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm glad you asked, because we were talking about the long ending of Mark, and I said some people deny it, including Wes Huff, and you said, well, what does Wes Huff say about it? Which is why I'm now talking about it. But like, I just think it would be, like I say, I don't know how many views this actually got, but as far as I know, there was no correction or anything. And the fact that he took it down shows that he knows that something went wrong there.
I haven't had a chance to talk with Wes about it. Obviously, I come at my worldview differently than Wes does. You know, I'm very open on a lot of this stuff, and certainly don't have the religious beliefs he does, but some of the things that he discusses are fascinating. He's been a good guy with me, but I'm in a position now where, he was on here saying things, and obviously there's things that have been translated to the internet where he's backed up with some of these things, and one of these things to me, unless I'm really missing something here, looks provably wrong. And I don't want to get into like this thing where I suddenly start criticizing a guy who's on my show. I do want to talk to Wes when I get off camera about this. However, there are a few things that are true right here. It's a very bad look that Wes blocked Gnostic informant on Twitter.
I don't know. Did he block him?
He did. I saw that the other day.
Okay. I don't know about that.
I don't believe in. I don't block anybody. All right. I think before I was ever in public or whatever, there were I blocked Skip Bayless, who doesn't know me. You don't know who that is. Good for you.
I've never blocked anyone either.
Right. I've never blocked a detractor or someone commenting against me or something like that. I've certainly never blocked someone who's got an audience who's speaking out against something I do or anything like that. So I full stop really don't believe in that. I think you have to let speech out there. So that I have an issue with. Secondly, if you are going to take the video down, that is a quiet admission of I fucked up. And if in that process someone else's reputation was hurt by your fuck up, and they were correct. I do believe you are obligated as a decent person to correct that record. And I know Neil's going to come on here at some point. Like
That's Gnostic Informant.
Yeah. He and I have talked about that.
Ask him about this, man.
I was out of the loop on this stuff. Like I don't get
honestly,
involved in the drama.
because that's the thing. It seems kind of drama, and part of me is like, oh, this is kind of interesting and juicy and that kind of thing. But I like to stay away from that. But I do think it's important to know this. But also bear in mind that, like, I might have misremembered a feature here. Like, as far as I know, like, it's possible that Wes has addressed it, or that he said he took it down for a different reason or something like that. But I spoke to Gnostic Informant, and as far as I know, the video was deleted and there was no correction or apology. Like, I might have got some of those details wrong. What I've definitely not got wrong is the content here. Like, that claim was made and it was wrong, and it was provably wrong in his area of expertise, which I don't know, man. Like, I don't really know what to make of it, because
Have you ever talked with Wes?
no, I'd love to. It's funny, when I made my video, people in the comments who said, well, you know, if you're so sure, why don't you just debate him? And I was like, if you watch the video to the end, I said that of course I would talk to him. Like, he's like the new like messiah of the Christian movement. Like, of course I talk to him. It'd be like a huge thing. Like, everybody wants to talk to him. But he's made a video where he said, I'm probably not going to debate you.
Yes,
where he's just saying, and like, I totally understand that, man. You get invitations like up the woo-ha. Like, it's crazy when something like that happens to you. But the thing is, half of the comments were saying, oh, why don't you just debate him if you're so scared? And then half of the comments were saying, "Oh, you're just trying to debate him into it. You're just trying to bait him into a debate for clout." So it's like, I'm either too scared to debate him, or I'm trying to bait him into a debate.
I'll shut that down right now.
No, but for clarity, like, of course I would love to speak to Wes Huff, but I kind of want people to stop coming after me, pestering me to do it, because the invitation is open. But I also don't want people to go and pester him to do it, because like, he's incredibly busy. He's got like a family. He's got stuff going on. Like, people don't understand. Like, he's a real human being. And also, he's just, the other reason I was hesitant about this is because he strikes me as just like a really nice guy. Like, he just seems like a very nice. Just like, seems very friendly, really nice, really like excited, and also, by the way, putting biblical scholarship like on the map. Like, he goes on Joe Rogan and starts talking about like P52 and like the manuscript traditions surrounding like John's Gospel and stuff. Like, that is amazing. It's amazing. That is like so cool, and I'm like so excited that that's happening. But the annoying thing is that, because he was so popular. Actually, I'm interested. Can we scroll down and look at the comments on this video while we're talking? Is that like, when I made my video about Wes Huff, I was actually like stunned. Yeah, check it out. So like, invite Wes Huff on. Tell me you're being paid by Billy without telling me. Did Carson pay you for this hit piece? This like dishonest as usual from the very start. You misrepresent how Wes responded to and it's kind of like, I can't even waste my time to watch this. Mythvision has so much bias against Christianity, jealousy at work here. And when I first started seeing this come through, I genuinely was like, are these just bots? Like, I don't think they are bots, by the way.
Some of them are,
I don't think they're bots.
A lot of them
but like,
are not.
When I made my video about Wes Huff, I was stunned by the amount of like, they'll still be there now, like comments. Just comments and comments and comments. And it was all the same stuff.
Comments on this
By
video.
the way, none of it was about the content. This was the thing that was suspicious. It was all like, you're jealous of Wes Huff's success. Whatever. You're trying to bait him into a debate. You're just upset you didn't go on Joe Rogan or whatever. So, you know, this kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, whatever. But there was such an influx of them that I was like, what is going on? And I saw the same thing happen to Mythvision. I saw the same thing happen to, I think, Cameron Batuzzi when he made a video. He's a Catholic. He makes a video about Wes Huff, and the same thing happens. And I was like, whoa, I was genuinely like stunned by it. And so, although I don't like pointing stuff like this out just for the sake of it, there is something kind of gratifying about it. But one doesn't like it, you know, because it essentially feels like gossip. But when you have dealt with months and months of people commenting, being like, well, you're just an idiot, and Wes Huff is a biblical scholar, and you're just a YouTuber guy, it's kind of like, come on, people. Like, let's cut the crap and like actually talk about the content here. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so, I don't know. And then, so if that's what's happening to me, and that's what's happening to Mythvision, can you imagine what Billy Carson is going through right now?
Yeah. Now, Billy is a little bit of a separate subject for me personally, because he gives it as much as way more than he takes.
To be clear, like, Billy Carson was just talking a lot of nonsense.
Yes,
like
he's out of his mind.
Like he seems to sort of. I know he's got the whole aliens thing going on or whatever. I've never like listened to him before, but I listened to some of him on like Flagrant and a little bit of the debate he had with Wes Huff, just because it was like a big deal. And
there's not enough weed in Narnia.
I'm hearing him say things that are just false, and Wes Huff has done a great job of bringing some of that out. So he's like confusing, like he says like the Sinai Bible and was confusing it with the Gospel of Barnabas.
Yeah.
And the Sinai Bible is Codex Sinaiticus, the 4th century manuscript
That's right.
of the Bible, and the Gospel of Barnabas is like this apocryphal, like Middle Age. And that makes a huge difference, right? So yeah. So to be clear, I wouldn't defend Billy Carson's claims, but even if you like mess up like that, I'm thinking like, I just can't imagine what it must be like, the comments he's receiving and stuff. But
Yeah.
anything about the Wes Huff stuff, for some reason, just got this huge response. And so I can understand why Gnostic Informant is looking at
I do too.
Wes Huff, like, especially as he gets really popular after the Rogan thing and everything, and everyone's saying like, this guy is like such a knowledgeable, brilliant scholar, and Gnostic Informant is like, this guy screwed me over. You know,
Yeah,
I can really see why he's so annoyed.
He has
about
a point, and you know, I obviously like he was already coming in here. I was less familiar with some of the details in this because, and I'm going to talk about him, and I want to address some of these points you're making. You're making a lot of really important points here. You know, the internet drama that happens with cults that form comment cults, I stay the fuck out.
Yeah,
of that,
it's
right.
great, but I'd never
So
seen it.
I've seen a bunch of that, and I know Neil was like said Gnostic Informant was sending me a bunch of stuff, and I was like, I don't want to know. Like, I know he's coming on the show later, so whatever he wants to say, he'll say, I like things being handled in here.
Yeah.
I understand that, you know, whether I like that or not, sometimes I don't have control over that.
But look,
And
man, I have been on the wrong end of vegans. I've been on the wrong end of
I'm
Muslims.
sorry to hear that.
Muslims. I've been on the wrong end. Maybe that could be a bit euphemistic.
I've never met a vegan who's a happy person.
Okay, you know I was vegan for like 4 years.
Yeah, were you happy?
Next question.
I'm a fucking meathead.
Yeah,
so.
but my control variable
Your
might have
control variable?
might have been a very unhappy meat eating Alex at the same time. But besides the point, I have been on the wrong end of all of these people. I have never seen anything like what happened when I made my video about Wes Huff, and I mean it. I mean, when I pissed off the Muslims, and they were coming after me in the comment section, it didn't even
they
come
went harder
close to
than the
compare.
Muslims.
Oh yeah. Not harder to, obviously they're not like saying I'm going to come to your house and kill you, right? Like they weren't doing that. But I mean, sorry, yeah, I don't mean to don't misunderstand me here. What I mean is like the level and consistency and amount, like the traffic. I genuinely just couldn't believe it. That's
right.
why I was first looking at this like, is this like bots or something? Because like they were because firstly none of them were about the content. All of them were identical. You could copy and paste them from my video to
Some of it is.
Mythvision to
Some of it is
Captain
bots.
Christianity. But like I don't think it is, just to be clear. That's not the accusation I'm making. But it was so stunning to me that I was just like, I just don't understand what's happened here. So I had to make this really long technical video about the book, the Great Isaiah Scrolls and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think essentially vindicated most of the stuff that I was saying. I never did my part 2 video responding to Wes Huff, which was going to be about Jesus claiming to be God.
Because
It
of
was
the
gonna be-
comment section.
No, not because of that. Just because I got kind of busy. And then one of the big sections that I was going to respond to was about whether Jesus claimed to be God. And I just recently had a debate about this. So I was preparing for the debate. And I kind of didn't want to like use all my arguments in a video and then go and debate because it was better to just save it for the debate. And so and also I was just like extremely busy. And so I just never ended up making it. And I still might. Like I still kind of want to do this part 2 Wes Huff, video.
I would much rather, and I want to see that, to be clear.
But I just didn't want it to seem like it was really coming out of nowhere.
I know. I want to see you two have a conversation and go about it.
I think that on most, like, I mean, because Wes's PhD, as I say, is on like New Testament manuscripts. So when it comes to things like the manuscript tradition and stuff, I think Wes Huff could like crush me. Not that I'd have much to debate him on. I'd query some of his like, I think some of his datings are like definitely against scholarly consensus, but also possibly like I think I'd want to like criticize them, but I would fully anticipate him coming up with some kind of argument or something where I'd go, oh cool, yeah, I'd never heard of that, interesting, because that's his field, and he would like crush me if it were a debate like that. I think there's a world in which we try to have some kind of debate where like it looks really badly for me, and I'm like, oh gosh, yeah, you're so right in ways I didn't know. That I could totally see that happening. I mean, I would much rather just have a conversation with the guy. But again, I don't do the like call out thing. I'm not like, Wes Huff, like come and
yes.
It's like, look, man, like
I agree.
obviously he knows that if he wants to like come on my podcast, he can come on my show.
It
Like,
doesn't need to be like that though either.
and
This
also
is the
him
problem.
not doing so is no indication of anything. He's just busy, man.
This is the problem with the internet. We are literally talking about like a religious conversation here too, where it's like a fucking 90s rap beef. Like, oh yeah, you got to call him out on the song and then drop, Jay-Z drops this, like Nas drop Ether. It should not be like that. That's ridiculous. there's two things that I think really got to get addressed here that are based on some of the things you've been sharing on this, and I appreciate you giving all the context too for everyone. And also, by the way, anyone who's like claiming someone like you would be clout chasing, I mean, I think last I checked, you have like 3 times the subs. Right. So that's bullshit, and you've been around a lot longer.
Right.
Number one, Wes's video about I won't debate you. I'm not going to say some of the stuff that I discussed with Wes offline about that because that's a personal conversation, but I will tell you some of my thoughts on that I also I said to him at least. But Wes, I think, because he also blew up so fast over something that is so important to him and so many people, which is the meaning of life, like the religion, he is extremely afraid to get things wrong and let people down in that way, and like maybe be the put out something that could be pulled as a string to say the whole house of cards doesn't exist with relation to Christianity, which unfortunately, if you're going to hold yourself to that standard, I don't even think Jesus had that standard. So I was like, you don't need to feel that way. Secondly, I'm like, dude, like if you listen to his podcast with Joe that he did in January, Joe even said it at one point when he was referring to Billy, where he's like, if you woke me up in the middle of the night and asked me about MMA or something to debate, he's like, I have enough that I could be like, wait, oh yeah. And I could go right into it. So when Wes says, I would need at least 6 months to prepare, no, the fuck you don't. You're not, it's a live debate. It's communication. It's not scripted. You're going to go back and forth. You will get some things wrong. You will hope to get more things right. If you know your shit, it's going to go down correctly. So I thought that was a bad argument, but there's also some stuff like, as you said, and I appreciate you saying that, like he's got some life stuff going on too. And a lot was being thrown at him all at once. Everyone wanted to debate him, including some people, not you, who were unheard of, who were just trying to clout chase to debate him for sure. So there was a lot going on there. But that also comes down to what has formed here, which you've talked about a lot, which is like the cult around this stuff. And it's so fascinating to me because some of it is bots, but to your point, a lot of it is not. And you know, I always talk about the concept, the universal law of physics. For every action, there's an equal but opposite reaction. It explains everything in the world. I'm a firm believer in equilibrium, in literally everything. It's like my curse in life. I see both sides. I understand why it lands here. But the violence of a reaction here to an action here is far lesser than the violence of a reaction here to an action here, right? And for people listening, not watching, I widen my hands with these two fists. And so when you see that over time, and it literally gets to the meaning that people have on this earth, which in this case they may define in their religion. You use the word yourself about Wes being this new Messiah or whatever. There are people who view him that way. And they're like, oh my God, we finally have a dude who can shadow box with people on the language and the text and the actual history and the ancient, you know, the Graham Hancock version of like Christianity.
And it's not just that, it's the fact that through whatever fortuitous circumstances, he's ended up on the biggest platform in the world of Joe Rogan. So even if people don't think that he's like the guy they would have chosen or whatever, it's like, well, he's now the guy. Like he's on Rogan. Like we need him to do well. We want him to do well. And everyone's very excited about it. And we hope that he does well, you know, and that's cool. That's great, you know. But like, there's so much to say. I mean, about like the debate thing. Like debates are also. I have a sort of on and off relationship with debates, and I don't know if I would be interested in debating Wes Huff. Like if it was set up, like yeah, sure. I mean, that'd be a big thing. But I'd much rather just talk to him because the thing that gets lost is
I see.
There's so much that's so interesting to talk about. Like, and when he says I'd have to prepare for a really long time. And you rightly say, well, if it's your area of expertise, as Rogan says, it's the first thing he says in their interview. Like, if you woke me up in the middle of the night, I'd be able to talk about this. It's like, yeah, you could talk about it. But if you're doing a debate, it's kind of a different story. Also because, like, if I had a debate with Wes Huff, we might talk about the reliability of the Gospels or the nature of Jesus. That's my wheelhouse. But we might also get into talking about manuscript traditions. That's his wheelhouse. So I would have to prepare because the conversation will go into areas that are not my expertise. And if it were a conversation, I could go, oh, okay, so tell me about this. I'm interested in this because you know about this. Can I ask you some questions? Whereas in a debate, it has to be, here's my rebuttal. You know,
right?
And so
you're going official. I see what you're saying.
For a debate, you kind of do have to prepare,
but not 6 months.
Depends on the nature of the debate.
That's what I'm saying. Like when you universally
maybe...
say 6 months for anyone, And we also know, and like his logic was, he said this part publicly, you know, well, I had 24 hours for Billy because that was Billy. And like to an extent, I get it because he's not even a moving target. But, you know, you could probably talk to someone in a week if you had to. Maybe you're not going to be perfectly as scholarly as sharp, but like if you're gonna, and this is just my opinion with anyone, whether it be Wes, whether it be you, if you're going to be an expert in a certain space and go and put your opinions out there, if you can't take the heat, don't come in the kitchen.
I think I agree to some degree, but I also do think that there are people who like producing educational content but aren't debaters. I don't think Wes Huff considers himself like a debater. That's not who he is. He's like an educator, and he likes making informational videos and stuff. There's a kind of temperament that you need to have to debate. Like there are people who are awful at debating but are incredibly good communicators. And I understand if someone says, look, that's just not how I roll. That's not what I do. Even if, but the thing is, there are ways around it. Like firstly, you have a conversation or a podcast. But I understand that, say Wes Huff saw this and said, okay, I want to speak to Alex. Even if we say, oh, it's just a conversation, he can't prevent me from like coming in with like a debate energy and like acting as if it's a debate and kind of trying to trap him in that way. So he's got to be ready for that, which means he'd have to prepare. I wouldn't do that, or I'd try not to do that, of course, but he doesn't know that, and I understand that he can't trust that with any conversation that he has. But there are other ways around it. Like you can do a series of response videos. You can do, people have done, they don't get as many views, but they're quite effective. I saw Cameron Batuzzi did this a while back where, you know, a debate, he's a Catholic YouTuber capturing Christianity. Yeah. You know, people in debates, they do opening statement, then the rebuttal, then a Q&A or whatever. They did this, but each of those segments was a video. So they put out the opening statement, 20-minute video, and then the other person can watch it, can take their time, take as long as they like, and put out their opening statement. Then for the rebuttal, this person, so it's formatted, there's a set format, but in between every speech, you get to stop, think, go, research, like, and it's just such a brilliant way of doing a debate, because what you're seeing is two people who you've chosen because you think they're good at what they do, but giving them the time and space to actually think and respond to everything. It's not like, oh, can you remember this on the spot? Oh, you're gonna, you know, because people make fun of this. Like in a debate, they'll be like, if someone like starts typing on the computer, they'll be like, oh, he's googling the answers because he doesn't know. Oh, look, he's fried. You know, it's like, okay, but that's only interesting on like a gossip level. Like if you actually want to know what the most interesting answer he could come up with is, which is ostensibly why you're here, then give him a month to think about it. You know. And so there are ways around this sort of, I don't want to debate, I need to prepare kind of thing. I like that as an idea, right? So there's loads of stuff that you could do.
By the way, you're also talking, like, you're referring, this should be stated, you're referring to like the official like word debate and what that means from like the old school debating format. When I'm being a little more liberal with my use of debate.
So just like getting two people in a room.
Yeah, like get them in this fucking podcast studio and talk. You know what? Like we're not going to sit here and be like, and the first subject is going to be that. It's more just live.
But also, I understand that Wes is like hot property. At least he has been. I don't know how. I know after the Rogan thing, it was like stratospheric. I don't know if that's still going at the same rate. I don't know if it's going to sort of tailor out, or whatever. But there's a sense in which it's sort of like know your worth. Like don't go and like debate, you know, anybody or this person or that guy, especially if you feel like you don't have time to prepare and it'll be a bad look for you for that reason. Like do your thing, man. Like you are experiencing this unimaginable experience that like that people dream of. It's like, enjoy it, man. Take the time, like make it content that's interesting to you. Use it for projects that you care about. He's got his Apologetics Canada thing. I think it's like an organization. He puts on events. Yeah, put all of your effort into leveraging what you're doing to make that a success. Like it makes so much more sense. I totally understand it. And for what it's worth, I have spoken to Wes, like you know, over message or whatever. It's not like he's like ignoring me or whatever. Like
that's good.
I know that he's just like a guy with a lot going on and seems like a nice dude, all this kind of stuff. Like
very nice.
Like, cool. It's why I don't, you know, I like, but I don't like doing all of this kind of stuff. And I hope if he sees this and is watching, he knows that like he understands why I think it's important to point this out.
Yeah, he'll see. I'm going to send it to him.
But at the same time, like I'm not just trying to take a stab in the dark here, right? But yeah, I mean, of course, the invitation remains open for him to come on my show, but also like that's my show, that's my thing. He doesn't have a show, but like maybe one day it will happen, and it might take a year or two or more for it to calm down or whatever, or maybe it will never happen. I don't know, but
yeah,
I would just, whatever, man. You know, like okay, we'll see what happens.
I would love to see an open discussion of the idea that religion has to be perfect is this expectation we've put on things, because I do feel like that's a part of it. People feel like if they admit that one thing may not hold water to evidence, that means the whole thing's not true. And to me, you know, it's ironic. We open up this conversation talking about like the perfect timing or whatever you want to say about how the universe is even
the multiverse,
world is even able to exist. Yet the great paradox to that is that things are also so beautifully imperfect. That's what defines humanity, at least in how I see it. And I don't see why that can't be the case with religion, even with a deified figure like Jesus Christ. We already pointed out that the Gospels that project him to be perfect also show things where he's not necessarily perfect, which I like. I think that's cool, you know, but there's this idea that, you know, oh, you can't talk about this because that would be blasphemy or whatever. Well, that's a non-starter. And I'm very careful because you pointed out, like when it comes to specific people, even maybe like a Wes or something like that, the comments will get weird. But when you start to talk about people's beliefs, they get real defensive about it. And I get that. So I try to do it as respectfully as I can. My own producer, Alessi, is like an enormous Christian. He's got the chain out right now. You know, like the dude, Lawrence Krauss walked in here who believes something came from nothing. The dude's wearing a cross shirt. I'm like, maybe not the day for that, but whatever, you know, it's cool. That's fine. So we have great discussions about this. Obviously, we come at it from a different lens. So I know it's possible to do that. Yeah. But for some reason, so many people are unwilling to do that, and I think it kind of defeats the purpose of like what someone like Jesus is supposed to stand for, which is like one of the things I would say is like listening to other people and understanding where they come from.
Jesus did have debates of a kind. It's kind of interesting watching his sort of confrontations with the Pharisees and the like. But the thing that does get lost is how interesting it all is. Yeah. So like on Wes's Rogan episode, he talks briefly about some of the like Gnostic Gospels and why they're not part of the canon, and talks about the motivation for not including them, and says that they seem to be like theologically motivated. I would love to talk to him about his idea about the theological motivations of the Gnostic Gospels versus the canonical Gospels. If that were a debate, I mean, in my video, he says, like, well, part of the problem as to why these Gnostic Gospels aren't included is because I might be misquoting him here, but he says something like, because they seem to have, like, theological motivations. They seem to have been written with, like, an apologetical purpose. And I'm like, well, so do the canonical Gospels. People think that about the canonical Gospels as well. And a lot of people were like, well, you cut out the reason that he gave because he was specifically talking about, you know, their uncomfortability with like the tomb story or whatever. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but like I've got interesting things to say in that, but I don't want to do it on the format of like, well, Wes says this, but I say to you, you know, I want it to be like, well, hey man, what do you think about this? You know, there's some really interesting like apologetical motives within the Gospels, even on the tomb itself. So like Wes is talking about how one of these apocryphal texts has people like camped outside the tomb, because like it's really important to them to show that like the tomb was being watched, that the body couldn't have been stolen or something. Like it was really, and this is part of the motivation. Yeah, I might be sort of misquoting or paraphrasing or whatever that, but there's some interesting stuff about the tomb in the New Testament. Like this is so interesting. One of the most important apologetical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus is the fact that the tomb was found empty. Right, Jesus is laid in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, and then there's an empty tomb. The disciples go to the tomb and it's empty. Now, this is, again, we're having a conversation, so this works. Because this isn't like some definitive proof of anything, but it's interesting that if you look at how the tomb is described in the Gospels, in Mark's Gospel, it's a tomb. In Matthew's Gospel, which is the next latest, it's a new tomb. Why is it a new tomb? Oh, because one of the most important observations of the Gospels is that the tomb was empty. But you could bury multiple bodies in a tomb. And so how do you know that Jesus had actually gone? What if he got mistaken for a different body? What if he got lost? What if there were loads of it? The important thing is that the tomb was empty, so we know that there was a body in there that's not there anymore. So Matthew's Gospel says it's a new tomb, because if it's new, no one else had been laid in it before. By the time you get to Luke's Gospel, it's described as a tomb in which no one had been laid. It's specified that no one had been laid in the tomb. And John's Gospel goes to the double whammy. It says, laid in a new tomb in which no one had been laid. So there's this like subtle indication, like is there like this increasing emphasis on the emptiness of the tomb, and so they really wanted to, and maybe the tomb actually was a new tomb in which no one had been laid, but they just felt like it was more important to emphasize that, or maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe it just happens to be the way that they're describing the tomb. But there's stuff like that which, if you read through the Gospels, there is absolutely no way you would notice that. There's no way you would notice that unless you have a specific question in mind. You go back to the Gospels and you read through them with that question in mind, which is what biblical scholars do, which is why even now, after thousands of years, people are still discovering things about the Gospels. Like something like that. You can imagine thousands of years, no one's noticed that sort of developmental description of the tomb. And then finally someone's like, this is kind of interesting. That kind of stuff is still happening because the Gospels are so dense and there's so much in them. And there's so many things that seem completely irrelevant unless you're asking the right kind of question. And that's one of them. So I'd love to know what Wes thinks about that, for example, and whether that at all influences his idea about motivations of the Gospels. That's a lot weaker than the obvious motivation in the Gnostic literature that he's talking about. But it's an interesting consideration, and I would love to know what he thinks, for example. And if that were a debate, that point that I've just made is nowhere near strong enough to make like an argument out of. To say, well, hold on a second, Wes, because here's some evidence of motivate. So I wouldn't use it. So it wouldn't get discussed. And people wouldn't know about it. But in a conversation, it's like, oh, hey, that reminds me of this, and let's talk about it. So it's so much more interesting for everyone as well, you know?
That's why I like that idea rather than the more formal format. Because, people, there's people who aren't going to be moved or swayed by anything based on, it doesn't matter if you tell them that wall is white there, here's the scientific reason why, they're still they're saying it's fucking black. But then there's a lot of people out there who, they just want to hear different ideas, and not one thing has to be 100% right or 100% wrong, and they want to try to get to the truth. It's like, I always talk about how I think one of the worst, curses that we've cast upon ourselves in humanity is making science and religion diametrically opposed to each other. They both seek the same answer. Why not work together?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not what wins the clicks. But there are a lot of people who might think that way.
These days, I think maybe the trend is reversing. Like
I hope so.
If you hosted a debate that was like science versus religion, I don't think anyone clicks on it because it's like kind of a dead horse. Like it was really popular during the whole height of new atheism and stuff like that, but people kind of lost interest. It's boring. Now people are more interested. Like the stuff about Jesus claiming to be God, for example. I just did this debate on whether Jesus claimed to be God in the Gospels.
Who'd you debate?
David Wood, who's a Christian YouTuber. And I think it's a pretty popular topic, which is surprising because it's like a point of like scriptural exegesis. It's but that kind of stuff is more interesting to people now because Christianity is experiencing a sort of popular revival in the online space. It's becoming cool again, and people are getting really into the weeds with it. So now this kind of new atheist, like science versus religion, problem of evil, it's kind of boring. People don't really care about it. They want like the biblical stuff, which is really interesting. And so now,
why do you think that happened?
Because it's just been done. Like we've had the debates and the discussions and like
no why do you think because I completely agree with you, there's been a phenomenon online that has spread to the real world where Christianity has become like very cool, which that's fine. I'm just curious why you think that's happened.
I'm not a sociologist, but there are some hypotheses. One is that Christianity is right all along, and people are beginning to realize it again. That's one explanation. Another explanation is to remember. You like that one, don't you?
Your mic wasn't on, but Alessi clicked.
Another explanation is that
he's such a good sport. I love this.
Like you could think that, look, new atheism was cool. It was really cool, and it was a phenomenon. If you were alive, like in 2008, 2009, I mean, I was alive, but I was like 9 years old, but you know what I mean? You would have seen the intellectual space become dominated by atheism. And it's happened throughout history. It happens in the Victorian era, kind of coinciding with Charles Darwin, and suddenly the intellectual elite, they're all atheists all of a sudden. And then you've got like religious revivals happening, and you get the growth of Mormonism out of revivals in America, and sort of goes back and forth, and like new atheism crops up, and it's really cool, and everyone's talking about it, and it's cool to be an atheist. And when you imagine a Christian, you imagine like your school teacher, sort of happy-go-lucky, and you've got the cool atheist in a leather jacket, like, well, actually, miss, you don't know about this, right? And okay, that's cool. But now Because people have gotten used to that and they begin to see through it. Now, when you think of an atheist, you think of the Reddit user with the fedora, and the Christian is the sort of like based Giga Chad. Like, you know what I mean? And so it's like a cultural shift. And
Yes.
and so why was New Atheism so popular? Well, maybe because it was cottoning onto something, or maybe it was just a publishing fad. And we've got kind of a YouTube publishing fad right now, Christianity. But that's one hypothesis. Maybe it is actually just experiencing a growth, because it always seems to come back. But I think things just ebb and flow. I think
You're right.
Christianity is sort of coming up, and then suppose like Joe Rogan converts to Christianity, that'd be huge, become a big thing, and then 5 years down the line,
It won't be cool.
and Rogan's talking about Christianity again, and it's like the same stuff, and all of these arguments people right now find really interesting. Like,
Yes.
gosh, why did the disciples die for their beliefs, and all of this kind of, oh, that's so interesting. All of that is just like is water under the bridge, and suddenly the guy who comes in and goes, well, actually, I think that might be a mistranslation of the Greek. It's like, oh, hello, this is fun, And so New Atheism before was all about the problem of evil and religion being evil. I don't think like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens know like a word of Greek. I mean, I don't know. But like all of these criticisms that we've been talking about, all of this interesting stuff. Well, did Jesus claim to be God? What about this translation? That stuff just kind of doesn't come up. There was a little bit about the virgin birth, actually, that Richard Dawkins likes to talk about. That's kind of interesting. But outside of that, like, no, it's like a different approach. And so if atheism becomes cool again, it's not going to be that new atheism style. It's going to be something else.
It'll be a new version
It's going to be scholarly. Because I think what people are interested in now is like the scholarly stuff, which for me is really exciting. I'm amazed that I've essentially become mostly interested in biblical scholarship. I used to be like a philosopher, essentially, or like a wannabe philosopher, analytic philosophy.
An Oxford philosopher.
An Oxford philosopher. Arguments, logical positivist, sort of arguments of the existence of God, premises, conclusions, syllogisms, all that kind of stuff. And I used to think that the rest was basically all like bunk. And now I just don't care about your stupid premises, man. I want to read the Bible. That's what I'm interested in. And it's amazing that that's happened. But I think that that's happening across the board, and people are interested in the text. And I'm constantly discovering things, especially in this debate about whether Jesus is claimed to be God or not. There are all, like, Christians often look at me like I've said that a square has three sides when I say Jesus didn't claim to be God, because it's like this obvious fact of the Gospels. In biblical scholarship for the past few hundred years, it's been mainstream just to say that Jesus didn't actually historically claim to be God. And that's like a later development into the doctrine.
Oh, they admit that.
Well, admit that is a strong term. Like, there are scholars who think that's the case. There are some scholars who think that's not the case. And a lot of biblical scholars are non-religious. So I think Morris Casey, for example, isn't a Christian, or wasn't a Christian when he wrote his, I forget what it's called. It's called like Jewish Prophet to Gentile God, I think, which is kind of a proto version of the most popular biblical scholar at the moment. It's probably Bart Ehrman, who you should have him on the show. I mean, he's fantastic.
Yeah, his name's come up.
He is phenomenal, man. He's great. But like a lot of Christians look at him and say, yeah, he's kind of cool, but he's actually not that great, because I think he's made some blunders in the past and stuff like this as well. Like, I remember when I was talking about this Wes Huff thing, my friends were pointing me to something that I wish I could remember it for fairness' sake, but something that like Bart had written that had a similar level of like just getting something wrong. I think it was about the telephone game, actually. But anyway, like, yeah, so those are your sort of scholars who are like, Jesus never claimed to be God. Bart Ehrman's book is How Jesus Became God, and it's about that kind of stuff. It's quite accessible. But Brant Pitre just wrote a book called Jesus and Divine Christology, which attempts to regain the idea that Jesus did make divine claims. But he opens the text, this is like last year, he opens the text by saying that most scholars think Jesus didn't claim to be God. And he describes this paradox. Most scholars think that Jesus didn't claim to be God, but most scholars think that very early on in Christianity, people started believing that he was God. So how do you explain this paradox? If he didn't claim to be God, why did they so immediately think he was God? And Brant Pitre's answer is to say, well, because he did actually claim to be God, and he gives all of his arguments why. And it's interesting, but I don't think Jesus claimed to be God. I think
you don't.
No, there are all kinds of arguments. That's why I say that Christians will look at me like I've lost my mind, but I think it's important to understand that in biblical scholarship, this is a very mainstream opinion. That's not an appeal to authority. I'm not saying it's therefore correct. I'm just saying it's not some like batshit, like wacky view. It's incredibly common. I think it might even be the most common view of scholars of Christology, but I don't know. So don't quote me on that. Don't even paraphrase me on that. But I find it absolutely fascinating. And Christians have their lines. They say, we've already discussed one. Jesus forgives sins in Mark chapter 2, and only God can forgive sins. But I've already given an explanation as to why I don't think that's him claiming to be God. And people say this just forgetting that in John chapter 20, Jesus gives the ability to forgive sins, the authority to forgive sins to his disciples. It's as if they just forget, or they say, oh, well, that's because they could only forgive sins, through Jesus. It's like, yeah, but what did Jesus say? As the Father has sent me, now I'm sending you. So if they're only doing it because Jesus gave him that authority, then Jesus is only doing it because God gave him that authority. It's like the same thing, right? Or they'll talk about how Jesus walked on the water. If Jesus walks on the water, you must have heard of that story.
Of course, yeah.
And he walks on the water, and in Job chapter 9, it's written that Job is speaking in it, and it's written that God alone treads upon the waves of the sea. Only God treads on the waves of the sea. And so people say, so that means
Jesus is God.
Jesus is, and it's calling back to this imagery. And again, they just kind of forget that Simon Peter then gets out of the boat and walks on water as well. And he starts sinking because he doesn't have enough faith. And Jesus sort of says, like, oh, you haven't got enough faith. That's why you're sinking. But the implication is that if Simon Peter had enough faith, he would have stayed afloat.
He'd be able to do it.
And so how did he stay? Oh, well, okay, but he could only walk on water because, he had like faith in Jesus. Okay, but then maybe Jesus could only walk on water because he had faith in God. In other words, the stuff I was talking about with John the Baptist, all of the indications that Jesus gives of things that only God should be able to do, that he can do, forgiving sins, glorifying himself, raising the dead, judging people, all of this kind of stuff, are all things which at some point or another he then gives to his disciples as well. As if to say that, yes, I have this authority that's come from God, but it's something that's been administered to me. And in John chapter 17, Jesus prays for his disciples and all Christian believers, and prays that they'll all be one together. Can you pull up John 17? This is one of the most instructive parts of the New Testament. Also, actually, if you just want an interesting tidbit of mistranslation before we go there, can you type in John 12:44? Actually, just in a new tab, because I want to go to a slightly different website. John 12:44, I think, is the verse. Yeah, check this out. So scroll down, go to Bible Hub. Scroll down. That one, Bible Hub. So this is John 12:44, right? So in the NIV, which is the most popular translation at the top there, then Jesus cried out, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me." So he's saying, he's basically saying that I've come from the Father. Like, if you believe in me, you don't just believe in me, you believe in the Father too. Right. So he's sort of claiming to be God here, right? However, look underneath. Look at all of the other translations.
Jesus shouted to the crowds, "If you trust me, you are trusting not only me, but also God who sent me."
Take a look at the English Standard Version.
And Jesus cried out and said, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me."
Do you notice a difference?
He's separating the two.
Do you notice a difference between the ESV there and the NIV? It's the word only.
Yeah.
So in one of them it says, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me." In others it just says, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me, but believes in the one who sent me." Now here's a question for you. But all of these have been translated from the same Greek manuscripts. Which one do you think the Greek aligns with? Do you think the word only is in the Greek? The answer is no, it's not. So how did it end up in the English? Because of translation philosophies. There are literalist translations.
Translation philosophies.
Yeah, because there are different ways to translate a phrase. Are you trying to translate the words, like word for word, or are you trying to translate the phrase? So for example, in the Old Testament, there's a verse about slavery where God says, it says of slaves, he says, they are their silver, I think he says. Like, that slave is your silver. Now, what that means is that the slave is your money, because silver is like a euphemism for money. Now, as a translator into English, you've got to look at the Hebrew and decide, are you going to translate it word for word and say the slave is his silver? Or are you going to translate the idea for an English reader and say the slave is his property?
Yeah.
So depending on what you're going for, it's going to do a different thing. So the NIV, the most popular translation of the Bible, is a so-called like phrase-for-phrase translation. So it tries to get at what the Bible means. Whereas if you read something like the NRSV, which is my favorite version, the New Revised Standard Edition, the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, so NRSV UE, this is an attempt to accurately translate the Greek terms, which I find most helpful because that's what I'm interested in. But if you're just trying to read for the stories, you might prefer the NIV. But you've got to realize when you're reading an English translation that you are reading through the lens of an interpreter.
Yes.
So in this instance, this is the most obvious case. Bear in mind that I'm debating whether Jesus claimed to be God. If you read the ESV there, and imagine I'm up and I'm at the podium and I'm doing my debate, and I say Jesus didn't claim to be God because look, he said, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me, but believes in the one who sent me." So he's separating himself from God. But now imagine my opponent gets up He's saying Jesus did claim to be God, and he just quotes the other translations of Jesus claimed to be God because he says, whoever believes in me, he doesn't just believe in me, but believes in the one who sent me. So I must have this connection. So that translation, that one word, is crucial to understanding the nature of Jesus and what he is claiming to be. And that is an interesting example of how I think they've taken too much. But you can understand the NIV translators, they've already assumed that Jesus did claim to be God. So when they come across the Greek, they're like, well, what did Jesus mean here? What idea was he trying to get across, and how can we convey that to an English reader? And when he said that they don't believe in me, but the one who sent me, what he means is like, they don't just believe in me. So they translated it that way. But if you've got a different interpretation, that's not how it reads. So if you are ever reading the Bible, and either something jumps out at you, you think it's important or interesting, or definitely if it's confusing, the first thing that you should always do, look on Bible Hub, scroll up to the top here, see where it says Greek, up a bit?
Yep, right here.
Yeah, that should, no, up a bit, sorry, yeah, just click on that. Anytime what you have is a breakdown of the original Greek text next to the words that's been translated. So if you scroll down a tiny little bit, whoever believing, the one believing in me, not believes in me, but in the one who sent me. So you can investigate it for yourself.
And there's brackets there too.
Yeah, so the brackets are kind of because, you know, it's not like a perfect translation into English. Like there are, like Greek uses the definitive article, so it says the equivalent of like the God a lot of the time, which that itself becomes really interesting when you look at John chapter 1. Like there's so like when John in John chapter 1 it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And later it says the Word became flesh. So the Word is Jesus. It says the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In fact, yeah, let's just do it. Can you pull it up? Can you go to John 1? Type in John 1 Greek. And then, yeah, click that Interlinear Bible. That'll do. Okay, so check this out. So you can see the orange text there. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? Notice that where it says, and the Word was with God, it says with ton theon, which in Greek sort of crucially is something like, so there's a dash there because the word that, we don't do that in English. We don't say it was the God. But in Greek, you have this definitive, you have this ton, which kind of crudely in English would mean something like the God. But notice how it says the Word was with ton theon, the God, and then it says, and the Word was ho logos. Sorry, and God was the Word. So you've got ho logos, the Word. You've got ton theon, the God. But it says the Word was with ton theon, but the logos was with theos. There's no ton. There's no definitive article. So in other words, it basically reads as the Word was with the God, and the Word was God. So some people look at this and say that, yeah, so the difference between God and the God in this instance is the difference between something like God as like a being and like God as like meaning just like divinity, or the same thing as God. So Jehovah's Witnesses are huge on this, for example, you know. So they translate this, I think, in their Bible as the Word was with God and the Word was a God, or something like that, you know. And so some people look at this and say, well, we should translate this as in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was divine, or something that means something similar, right? If you look at the Greek, at the very least, it's interesting that in one of these instances, it's ton theon. In the other instance, in the next usage, it's not. It's just theos. There's no definitive article. And does that make a difference? Well, who knows? I don't know. But that's not even a question you can ask if you're just reading an English translation and you trust it all the way. Anyway, we were just about to look at John 17. Stop me if we're going too long, by the way.
No, you're good. This is great.
17.
John 17. So this is you can click off that. This is the most interesting chapter for me. So he's if you scroll down a bit, a little bit more. So he's praying for his disciples. There we go. Praying for all his believers. So he's just prayed for his disciples. And then he says, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message. That is all Christian believers. That all of them may be one, Father. Just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so the world may believe that you've sent me. I've given them the glory you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them, you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. So he's talking about the disciples and all Christian believers all being in me as I'm in you, and we'll all be one, and we're all going to be together. This is like, whoa. Well, what do you mean? Like Jesus and the Father have a distinct, unique relationship. What do you mean that I've given them the glory that you've given me? What do you mean that they're all going to be one with me in the way that I'm one with you? What on earth are you talking about? So
What
I'm
do you
reading
think?
this, and I'm seeing Jesus here. If Jesus, so Christians will look at the way that Jesus is like amplified and glorified and say he's claiming to be God. I'm like, if that's what he's doing, then he's making the disciples gods as well. So for example, in John's Gospel, Jesus says things like, I and the Father are one. In John chapter 10, verse 30, he says, I and the Father are one. And the Jewish opponents pick up stones to stone him to death because they say, you're claiming to be God. And he says to them, haven't you read your scripture? There are other people in the Old Testament who are called gods. Why can't I do the same thing? Why are you accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God? So he clarifies that he's not claiming to be God in the way that they think. And then, another important part of the Gospels is when Philip, the disciple Philip, asks Jesus to see the Father. And Jesus says to him, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And again, Christians point to this and say, see, he's claiming to be God. Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. But when he explains what he means, he then says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. So when Philip says, when do I get to see the Father? He says, Philip, how long have you been with me? And you don't know that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me and I'm in the Father. So when he's asked about his relationship to the Father, he says, well, the Father's in me and I'm in the Father. Then you jump to John 17, where he's saying, well, I pray that one day all of the disciples will be in me, just as I'm in you, and we'll all be in each other all together. So
we can be equal.
Yeah, so all of these indications of like Jesus apparently claiming to be God in a unique
Right.
sense seems to be things that he's saying that the disciples and maybe all
Are
Christian
gonna be
believers can do too.
capable of.
I don't believe that the 12 apostles, let alone the rest of Christendom, can become Yahweh. So I've got to reinterpret this. I've got to say, like, when Jesus says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me, if that's something that's also accessible to the disciples, it can't be Jesus claiming to be identical with Yahweh. It must mean something else. So a lot of these arguments I reject for those reasons. So when you ask me about what I think Jesus is doing, I think he's providing some kind of idyllic example. A really interesting examination or explication of that comes from him walking on the water. As I say, he walks on the water. Peter then walks on the water as well, but he starts sinking because he doesn't have enough faith. So Jesus is the idyllic, faithful. Jesus is the idyllic, faithful person.
Right.
It's like if you have the right amount of faith, you will be able to walk on water. And because Peter can do it for a bit, it implies that that is the kind of power that he could have had if he had enough faith. At the very least, it's an indication that you don't have to just be Yahweh incarnate to be able to be given the power to walk on water. You can be given it by God without having to be God himself. And I think that theme is consistently throughout the Gospels.
What really sucks about this stuff is like you want to know the truth.
Mm-hmm.
You want to know where it all comes from. You want to know why the universe is here,
Yeah.
who controls it, where God is, if he exists, what he's like, which of the religious books gets it right, which gets it wrong, if there's a mix of whatever. But sadly, everything is set up where it's a layer that leads to a layer of 10 things that leads to a layer, but it's exponential.
But I
And
love it
it's-
for that reason.
No, it makes it fun.
Yeah.
But the complexity makes it also, it may be fun, but it's also exhausting because the average person is like, man, I got to work my fucking, I got to pay the bills. You know what I mean? I don't have time to fucking look through Codex, Sinaiticus, or whatever the fuck it's called. You know what I mean? And yet, you can run, you've already done it, like melted my brain today, where you can run in circles with some of these phrases that, by the way, are just one translation of the fucking 45 translations that also have all different meanings. And then we're trying to decide which one is which. And it's like, at the end of the day, I see why the church has been able to just sell this. Like, listen, there was a guy named Jesus, he said he was God, he came down, died for your sins. Now take this fucking communion and live a good life. Like, it's simple.
Yeah.
People are like, that's a simple story. Sounds cool. I want to do that. And I get that.
And by the way, like that might be correct, like because all of this goes on, and bear in mind, like, when these documents first emerge and people are like, this is the stuff that people are doing. They're like, oh my goodness, there's so much here. What the hell are we going to do? So they all get together and decide on their doctrines. They're like, we're going to get together and we're going to work it out. So they go through all of this kind of stuff. And they're like, this is what we think. Are we all agreed? Cool, set. And then no one has to worry about it. Because this debate has already taken place. It's already been done. And that's that. And what like Catholics in particular will say is like, these debates happen. The issue is settled. And we have to accept that the Holy Spirit has guided them to make the right decisions, and we have our doctrines, and that's what we believe. The problem is that that does offer you the ability to not have to worry and look into it yourself. But then if you start reading it yourself and you're like, actually, I'm not actually so sure they got it right, then cool, you've regained your spiritual freedom and whatnot, but you've now got this massive problem to deal with, which is you've got to go back through absolutely everything and see what you find. So that's why I'm glad I came at this not as like a Christian who started questioning and going, oh, but what about this? Oh, but if that's that, then what about this? Because then it's sort of like stressful and you're all over the place. For me, I'm looking from the outside and I'm like, John the Baptist is interesting. I'm just going to look up him. And as a Christian, you might be like, oh, but that means that I'm going to have to think about this. And that's for me. I'm like, I don't have to worry about that at all. I'm just like, who's this guy? What's interesting about him? Yeah. And you can just look at what's interesting. And the funny thing is, right, we opened this conversation talking about the Gnostic Gospels. And we opened up like a tab about the Gospel of Judas because I was going to get into explaining all this stuff in the Gnostic Gospels because I find it really interesting. And we didn't even do it because we got so caught up in the Bible. But like, I just find it quite funny that I've just realized that we didn't even talk about it because all of this stuff.
You can go for it now if you want.
All of this stuff is in the canonical tradition, and then you've got this Gnostic tradition which has this wacky other, like this completely different kind. In fact, one of the most important Gnostic groups are called the Mandaeans, who still exist. These are guys who believe that John the Baptist is the most important and final prophet. They believe Jesus was a false prophet, and that the reason John the Baptist didn't want to baptize him isn't because he was unworthy, but because he knew he was going to be trouble. It's like it's mental. It's so cool to think. I mean, these Mandaeans, they claim to be the descendants of the original followers of John the Baptist, but anthropologically we know that's probably not the case. Type in Mandaeans. There you go.
Oh, I thought you spelled that right for a minute or less. I was going to give you credit. But I see it was a different Google.
There's John the Baptist. He's great. And so you see where it says John the Baptist and the Essenes underneath. The Essenes are a religious group that a lot of people think John the Baptist belonged to. And by extension, some people think that Jesus belonged to this too, and it explains many of the. If you type in Essenes and pull up the Wikipedia, it's quite widely accepted that John the Baptist was an Essene. But I know that James McGrath, who wrote the John the Baptist stuff I was talking about earlier, I think he disputes this. Essenes, there you go. So a Jewish sect that flourished between the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE, so the right time
So
period.
they're part of the Jewish religion.
Yeah, as Jesus himself was and John the Baptist would have been.
So you have Orthodox Jews, you have secular Jews, and you have Essene Jews.
It's not quite delineated like that.
I'm fucking with you.
Okay. Okay, that's good. But yeah, you can see, for example, they've got an emphasis on ritual purity. So the Mandaeans who exist today as followers of John the Baptist, they see baptism as a continual thing. They're constantly washing themselves. In Christianity, it became something you do once and then you're done with it and you're in the faith. For them, it's like a ritual thing. They're constantly washing themselves. And so the Essenes emphasis on ritual purity, asceticism. You know what asceticism is? So like
heard of that,
throwing off
actually.
like earthly goods and like sort of living in essentially like chosen poverty. And you see how John the Baptist is described as living in the wilderness, eating locusts and honey, wearing like, camel skin. So he seems to be an ascetic as well. And their community at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, which is kind of interesting as well. So yeah, some people think if you type in "was John the Baptist an Essene," it'll probably give you like an AI overview of the kind of stuff I'm talking about. But the thing is, it's kind of interesting, and so yeah. So it says while the parallels between John the Baptist and the Essenes are striking, there's no definitive evidence to prove that John was an Essene, though some have suggested it. So yeah, as I say, it's debated, but it's a popular scholarly view that he was an Essene. But the thing is, we just don't know very much about these people. But we know that the Mandaeans. Can you type in? Can you just type in like Mandaean Book of John or something like that? I forget what they actually call it. Book of John, I think, and try and find like an online version. Yeah, go down to notice.org. Go back down there.
This one?
Yeah. And then Control F or Command F for Jesus. So this is the Mandaeans' actual literature. Okay, so now go down. Sorry, go down instead of up.
This one?
Yeah, click down and then click it again. Okay, check this out. So this is the Mandaeans' literature, which we're not supposed to be able to read, by the way, because they don't want other people reading it. But this is what they're telling them, and they do it. It's sort of in the form of a poem. Who told Jesus? Who told Jesus Christ, Mary's son? Who told Jesus so he came to the Jordan's banks and told him, John, perform your baptism over me and pronounce over me the name you pronounce. If I become your disciple, then I shall mention you in my epistle. If I do not become your disciple, then erase my name from your scroll. So Jesus goes to John the Baptist and says, if you baptize me, if I become your disciple, I'll mention you in my epistle. I'll write about you. But if you don't, erase me. And then they have this debate. John spoke to Jesus, saying to Jesus Christ in Jerusalem, you have lied to Jews. You have deceived men, the priests. You've cut off the seed from men and labor and pregnancy from women. You loosened the Sabbath that Moses ordained in Jerusalem. All of this kind of stuff. And they're having like a debate and a discussion. Jesus Christ saying to John in Jerusalem, if I have lied to Jews, then may a burning fire consume. This is like, whoa, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And this is their belief as to what happened at the baptism of Jesus. John is like, no, man, you're a deceiver. You're a liar. You're a false prophet.
Totally different.
And Jesus is like, come on. And then I think eventually God like tells John, like, go on, just baptize him. And then Jesus becomes this false prophet. There's something interesting about the fact that John the Baptist accuses him of loosening the Sabbath. And I can't remember what it is exactly, but James McGrath lent me this view where basically there's something about it which means it probably wasn't like made up by the Mandaeans, because I think the Mandaeans don't care about the Sabbath. Like, you know how Christians don't like care about the Sabbath in the same way that Jews do.
That's right.
I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the Mandaeans also don't keep the Sabbath, which means that the fact that they have their final prophet saying you loosened the Sabbath as a criticism of Jesus, that's not something they would make up, because they don't keep the Sabbath. So they wouldn't make up this criticism of Jesus. Well, you've messed up the Sabbath, because they do that too. So wherever this text came from, it wasn't just like invented out of thin air, you know? 'Cause that's not something they would invent. So really interesting text that you can sit and read at home. But yeah, they're a Gnostic sect, so they have this weird cosmology like all of the Gnostics. But I just thought it's worth a mention. These followers of John the Baptist are really cool. But there's a whole series of Gnostic Gospels, and some of them are extremely weird. So like the Gospel of John, Gospel of Judas, you can imagine this gets discovered in the 1970s. And again, we knew that this existed because Irenaeus wrote about it. So we know that it's pre-180 because he wrote about it in 180. And finally, we discover this text, and we're like, we think this is the Gospel of Judas. So Bart Ehrman is one of the guys who goes to validate this for National Geographic, and they want to give them enough to see, the guy who owns it, they're like, we want to give them enough to verify it, but not so much that they can just read it because they haven't bought it yet. So National Geographic buy it for like $1 million or something. You can probably look. Can you type in Gospel of Judas? It might have been a lot more. Can you type in Gospel of Judas and find like the actual PDF of the text? Because the crazy thing is, right, so they're reading this text, and you can imagine, we know that this is actually, can you go back and go on, yeah, Gnosis or Gospel, something like that will do. Yeah, so this is the actual translation of the thing itself. So it opens underneath the introduction. You can see this is the secret message of judgment Jesus spoke with Judas Iscariot over a period of 8 days. Can you scroll down?
Yeah, go down. When he appeared on earth, right there.
So check this out, right? So you can imagine you're a biblical scholar. You know that this Gospel of Judas exists, and then somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, we've dug up this papyrus," and you know how it opens? It says, "This is the message. This is like the secret message that Jesus gave to Judas," and you're like, "Oh my."
That's like
is
holy
this it?
grail
If
shit.
this is like unbelievable. It's like, it's Judas, for those who don't know, is the man who betrays Jesus. He's the man who comes and kisses him on the cheek and betrays him. Why does he betray him? Well, the Christian tradition has it that he is evil. John's gospel says that Satan entered him, and that's why he betrayed Jesus. The synoptics seem to kind of imply that he might have done it for money or for some other reasons. That's a really interesting question too. But this gospel opens. One day he was with his disciples in Judea. He found them sitting, practicing their piety, and his disciples are sitting together praying over the bread, and the word there is the same word for Eucharist. So they're doing the Eucharist. They're praying over their bread. So Jesus comes upon his disciples praying over their bread, and Jesus laughs at them. Jesus doesn't laugh in the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of Judas, he laughs 4 times. So they're praying, like saying grace. They're doing the Eucharist, and Jesus laughs at them. And they say, "Master, why are you laughing at our prayer? What have we done? Oh, we've done what's right." And he answered them and says, "I'm not laughing at you. You're doing this because you want to. Not because you want to, but because through this, your God will be praised."
Your God.
Your God. So Jesus sees them praying over their food, and he starts laughing, and they're like, "Why are you laughing?" He's like, "Oh, no. You go ahead. You worship your God." Yeah. Well, and it's like, whoa, what is going on here, right? So then they say, "But Master, you are the Son of God." And Jesus says to them, "How do you know me? Truly I say to you, no generation of people among you will know me." When the disciples heard this, they started to get angry and furious and started to curse them in his heart. And Jesus says to them, "Why are you letting your anger trouble you?" And he says, "If any one of you is strong enough among humans to bring out perfect humanity, stand up and face me." So so they're saying, "But you're the Son of God." And he's like, you don't know anything. And they're getting angry. And he says, "Well, if any one of you knows anything, go on, stand up, speak to me." Guess who stands up? Guess who's got the confidence? Judas Iscariot. So Judas stands up. This is, by the way, I'm getting told the story over dinner. When I first hear about the Gospel of Judas, someone says, have you heard of it? I'm like, no, I don't think so. And they're telling me.
How many years ago?
This is, I don't know, a few years ago. It's not actually that long ago. It's probably like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe even less. I'm not sure. But at dinner, and he's like, you know what it says, right? And so he tells me all this. I'm like, this is so interesting. Then this is where I like nearly dropped the knife and fork and just ran home to read it myself, because so Judas actually stands up to him and he can't quite look him in the eye. He stands before him, and Judas says to Jesus, I know who you are and where you've come from. You've come from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I'm not worthy to utter the name of the one who sent you.
Barbello?
Barbello. It's like, what is going on? This is when the scholars are reading this, and they're like, okay, we know that this is a Gnostic gospel, because Barbello is a name of one of the emanations of God in the Sethian sect of Gnosticism. So there are different kinds of Gnosticism, one of them called Sethianism. Don't want to get too wordy or technical, but
We passed that point 2 hours ago.
But Barbello is recognizably one of these like sort of divine figures within the Gnostic religion, within the Sethian Gnostic faith. So scholars reading this are like, Barbello, dang, it's a Gnostic gospel. So this is a proper Gnostic gospel. And so, yeah, it begins with this remarkable drama where the disciples are praying. Jesus laughs at them, says, you're worshipping your God. So who is their God? And remember what I told you earlier about the Gnostic view that there's the evil material world and the good spiritual world. The evil demiurge is the creator of the material world. So these disciples are praying over their bread, the material stuff. And so Jesus comes in, he's like, yeah, you're worshipping your God. You're worshipping the evil demiurge. And that's why he says to them, none of your generation will be worthy of this. Like that, you're all getting it totally wrong. And Judas is the one who knows. He stands up and says, I know that you've come from the realm of Barbello. The realm of Barbello is the plethora, the spiritual world.
So the one who is the alleged traitor of him is the one who knows where he comes from, according to this.
Exactly. And so scholars begin reading this, and it's popular to think that this is the gospel that paints Judas as the secret hero. It's not that he's the evil betrayer, he's the secret hero, because he was the one who truly understood where Jesus came from, and so he enacts this plan because he knows what it's all really about. That view then came into it got contested, because there's some stuff which
I would imagine
Judas himself in this gospel at points is depicted as someone who himself, he also isn't going to like enter into the plethora. He's also not part of the generation that's going to essentially experience salvation, I suppose. Which means although he's the guy that understands it, he's not like the hero of the story. It's kind of complicated, as you can imagine. But you can imagine reading this as a biblical scholar and just being like, oh my goodness. Here we have the actual, we've heard about this for so long, and now we have it from the horse's mouth. This is incredible. And so, yeah, they're praying. Jesus laughs at them, says, you're worshipping your God, which presumably the evil demiurgic God. And then Judas gets up and says, I know where you've come from. You've come from the realm of Barbello. And he's like, yeah, damn right I have. It's like, whoa, what is going on here? So then there's this whole, the rest of the Gospel of Judas, a lot of it is just about Jesus explaining cosmology. So the Gnostic cosmology is like insane. There's this ineffable creator being called like the invisible spirit. And the invisible spirit, for whatever reason, emanates like other beings. So sometimes it's his attributes. So I'd done a whole episode on the Gospel of Judas with Bart Ehrman, one of my favorite episodes, if people are interested, because he's actually an expert in this. And it's like emanating different beings. So like wisdom is a being. Sophia, the word philosophy means love of wisdom. Philo,
I didn't know that.
So philosophia. So philo meaning love, as in phile, you're an Anglophile. You love England, phile, love, philo, love of wisdom, Sophia. So the name Sophia means wisdom. So there's this God in the Gnostic, or emanation of God in the Gnostic cosmology called Sophia, who is wisdom. But yeah, so all of these different emanations. And then for some reason, something goes wrong, and there's like this, one of these emanations like is kicked out of the plethora. The plethora is the big collection of all of the spiritual beings, right? And this is where, it does start to sound a bit Billy Carson, but like, I don't think any of this is true. I just, this is what the Gnostics believed.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And so you've got some kind of disaster where one of these gods seems to sort of get kicked out of the plethora and tries to recreate the spiritual world, and that's what the material world is. Some traditions say that it was an accident, like he was just incompetent, he was trying his best, but was not good enough. Some people say it was evil. I think that the Sethians, I'm not sure about this, but I think that they might believe that, when God says like, I am the only God, you shall have no other gods before me.
Yes.
That he was mistaken because he'd fallen out of the plethora. And so he creates this material world and mistakenly believes that he's the only God. But he's just the God of the material world because that's like all he knows. But he mistakenly says, I am the Lord your God, you'll have no other before me, I'm the big dog, I'm the guy, I'm like, this is my... And that explains why you have this Old Testament God who creates this material world and then walks around like he owns the place, like creating Adam and Eve and then saying, you got to worship me and I'm in charge and you shouldn't worship anybody else. And so who's Jesus? Well, Jesus comes up from the realm of Barbello, which is the plethora. He comes into this material world and basically to tell people, you need to understand that you're trapped in this material world, and through the right knowledge, you can be saved. So that is the cosmology that is at the base of the Gospel of Judas. So Jesus explains this whole cosmology. Just scroll down to like a random point, maybe like 2/3 of the way down. Scroll a bit further, about there. Okay, so like, and Adamus was the first cloud of light that no angel could ever see among all those called God. And Adamus beget Seth in the place after the image and likeness of the angel, and he must be made the incorruptible generation of Seth appear to the 12. It's like all of this crazy. Then 72 luminaries themselves made 360 luminaries appear in the uncorruptible generation according to the Spirit's will, so that there'd be 5 for each. I'm honestly, man, don't even try to read this. It is just like the most wacky,
it's garble,
crazy, But this is Jesus explaining how the cosmos came into being, how Adam and Eve came into being. And it's the Gnostic version of it, which is like completely different to the Orthodox Christian position, which is why these guys get condemned and why it ends up buried in the desert. If you scroll right to the bottom, we'll see how it ends. Up a bit. Here it is. Immediately there was a disturbance. Okay, so then Judas, so this is at the end of the vision. Then Judas looks up at the luminous cloud, which is the plethora, I guess, in his vision. And entered it. Those standing on the ground heard a voice from the cloud saying, some stuff missing, great generation, and Judas didn't see Jesus anymore. There's a lot missing because it spent 16 years in a safety deposit box in New York City. Immediately there was a disturbance among the Jews. Their high priest grumbled because he'd gone into the guest room to pray, but some scribes were watching them closely, blah, 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 blah. And they approached Judas and said to him, what are you doing here? Aren't you Jesus' disciple? Then he answered them as they wished. And Judas received some money and he handed him over to them. The Gospel of Judas. That's where it ends.
So it ends with
with Judas handing over Jesus.
The actual story.
So Jesus explains the secrets of the cosmos to Judas. And maybe because Judas now understands the mission,
he's like, all right, get him the fuck out of here.
Yeah, he's like, dude, I can't handle this. Like, but yeah, that's where it ends. And it's kind of eerie because that's where it ends.
You're gonna make him shut up. Take him.
yeah. Give me some money. That's fine. Yeah.
I didn't say kill him.
It's not. It's not entirely. It's not entirely clear what's going on there. But it's like it's wacky, right? It's like totally wacky.
It's very.
And so you can imagine Christians looking at this and being like, well, this is obviously nonsense. This is obviously heretical and whatnot. But biblical scholars looking at this and being like, whoa, this is so cool. So the headlines at the time, this is like 2006 or something, like National Geographic is running like the secret gospel that shows Judas is the good guy. Like, oh, we've discovered it, and it's like a huge story. And like this is like, Dan Brown level like interest, because I think the Da Vinci. I don't know when the Da Vinci Code came out.
2006.
Okay,
well,
so
not the book. The movie came out in 2006.
Yeah, so it's all like
timed.
it's all like part of the hype, man. I'm not sure if it was 2006 when it was finally published, but it was around then, Like it's just all of this hype, and this is a real one. Like this is actually the Gospel of Judas. It's fascinating. And there's some really wacky stuff. Like, can you open up the Gospel of Thomas? So this is found in the Nag Hammadi library and is probably dated to the 2nd century. Some scholars think that it might be dated earlier than the canonical Gospels, but that's extremely controversial. This is what's known as a sayings gospel.
A sayings gospel.
Sayings gospel. So it just basically contains a bunch of sayings of Jesus, not really any other context. So, for example, and he said, whoever discovers the meaning of these sayings won't taste death. And like that's kind of it. That's how it opens. Jesus said, whoever seeks shouldn't stop until they find. When they find, they'll be disturbed. When they're disturbed, they'll be amazed and reign over the all. And so it's just like a list of sayings. Some of these are sayings that we also find in the canonical tradition. Some of them are definitely not. So scroll to the very bottom, the last one. Yeah, there's a lot of them. And to be honest, it looks kind of long, but you can read this in like half an hour, and it's just a bunch of sayings. Some of them are absolutely fascinating. This is the most famous one, the very last one. And Simon Peter said to them, Mary should leave us because women are not worthy of life. Now, what would you expect Jesus to say from what you know of him to this? You'd expect him to say like, oh, of course she can inherit eternal life. Just because she's a woman, that doesn't mean that she can't inherit eternal life. Here's what he says in the Gospel of Thomas. look, am I to make her a man so that she... I don't like this translation, but okay. Am I to make her a man so that she may become a living spirit too? She's equal to you men because every woman who makes herself manly will enter the kingdom of heaven. That is an incredibly...
Every woman who makes herself manly?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting interpretation. Can you just type in Gospel of Thomas 1:14? Because this is what I would describe as a progressive translation. So... Oh, sorry, wait. No, sorry, just 114, not 114. Just number 114. And see if we can find the text. So yeah, try it there. Try that. Click on that. Is this the whole Gospel of Thomas? Can you scroll down to 114?
That's long.
That's very long.
So I want to find a more classical translation. There you go. Yeah, okay, so this is how it's more commonly translated. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go away from us because women are not worthy of eternal life." Jesus said, "Look, I will draw her in so as to make her male, so that she may too become a living male spirit similar to you.
I don't like that.
But I say to you, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." So this other translation has clearly tried to posit this as like slightly differently. It's tried to reinterpret the words, and I don't know which is correct because I don't read Coptic. People think it was originally written in Greek, by the way, but the version we have from Nag Hammadi is Coptic. And so this is the most famous saying where Jesus says, well, I will make her a male because any woman who makes herself into a man will inherit eternal life. And it's like, what does that mean?
I don't want to know what
it's
that
really
means.
Weird. Can you command F for let's say prostitute? Okay, try. Actually, I don't want to throw out a bunch of words. Do son of a. Yeah, check it out. Okay, so
whoever will come to know father and mother, he will be called son of a whore.
Yeah,
Jesus said that.
Well, no, he probably didn't because this is a non-canonical.
Yeah.
But there is a
that
tradition.
Sounds very not Jesus.
So again, a bunch of sayings, which like 105. Again, no context, just a sayings gospel. It says, "Whoever will come to know the father and mother, he will be called the son of a whore." Some translations have he will be called the son of a prostitute. And that is like it. That's all you got. The thing is, I read an introduction to a Gospel of Thomas once because this mystified me. I was like, what does this mean? And I read an introduction once which said that the Coptic word for whore or prostitute is extremely similar to either the word for like father or the word for like God or something like that. And so it seems like this, like in the original Greek, it might have been whoever will come to know his father and mother will be called a son of God or something like this. But the Coptic word is very similar, and so there was a little mistake that was made, and that's why we end up with this really strange.
Yeah,
I mean,
changes
that
the whole
seems to be
context.
the explanation, because otherwise, what on earth could this mean? But it's weird enough that you don't know. So read through all of this, and it's so interesting. Can you Control F for divider, or just like divide?
Divided.
Yeah, and then go up. So we're not in the there. Okay, so check this out. So this is really fun to me when I was reading this. Now this is just my interpretation. Reading through the Gospel of Thomas and all the sayings, one of the things you'll notice is there's a big emphasis on unity. There's the idea that people have become disparate and they need to be unified, and it's all about unity. You must be unified to each other. Some people, that's their explanation for the woman verse as well. They say that because you ever heard of the Platonic myth of how human beings originally had 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 heads, and they were split in half and spent the rest of their lives trying to search for someone to bring them together. So there's this sort of Platonic myth that's the original form of human beings, and that's why we all long to find a partner and come together, because our idyllic form is this 8-limbed being with 2 heads who gets separated, and we have to sort of find the other person so we can come together again, and it's all about unity. And a lot of that like Platonic thought seems to underlie some of at least the Gospel of Thomas. And so there's this emphasis on unity throughout the whole Gospel. And then I was reading this saying here. So a person comes to Jesus and says, "Tell my brothers that they have to divide my father's possession with me." Or might be translated as like, "Tell them how to divide my father's possession with me." Okay. So someone says, my dad's just died. Can you tell me how we should divide up the property? And Jesus says to him, "Man, who has made me a divider?" He turns to his disciples and said to them, "I'm not a divider, am I?"
Like he's asking them?
Or some translations say, "I'm certainly no divider." I was like, well, what could this mean? And I was
the
reading this.
context is different.
I was like, is he making a joke? I think Jesus is making a joke here because all of these sayings are about his emphasis on unity. Remember in John 17, I will be one with you, you'll be one with me. It's all about unity and it's really important. And he's constantly emphasizing unity. And then someone comes up to him with a trivial question like, oh, how should my father divide up my property? And he says to the man, like, who's made me a divider? Turns to his disciples. I'm certainly not a divider. Do you know what I mean? Because they know that he's all about unity. So he's like making a joke.
Timing.
So he's like making a joke. He's like, well, I'm no, because it's the fact that he says to the man, who's made me a divider? And then he turns to his disciples and goes, I'm certainly no divider, am I? Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
I sort
what you
of
mean.
read this as like a joke because his whole thing's unity. And he's like, this guy thinks I'm a divider, lads. Isn't that funny? It's fascinating, man. And again, I don't know if that's a legitimate interpretation, but they're just a bunch of sayings. It's fascinating. And again, this is something that we know is a genuine, fairly ancient. Well, it is ancient, but it's Christians will argue like, because this is really important. Like, if the Gospel of Thomas is early, if it's like written at the same time as the Gospel of Mark, then you've got a big problem on your hands because you've got two contemporary accounts that say totally different things about Jesus. Yeah. So the majority of scholars date it to the mid to late 2nd century, and for Christians, that's enough to say, okay, it's a later document, it's a development, and a lot of it's just like BS. If it is the case that it's dated earlier, it causes a lot of trouble. I have no idea. As I say, dating is very speculative, but there are suggestions either way. So some people think that this has like an Aramaic core of sayings that are legitimately Jesus's and date really early. There's also a hypothesized sayings gospel that we don't have access to. It's called Q. The word for source in German is Quell. So remember how I said that Mark's gospel came first, and then Matthew and Luke both relied heavily on Mark.
Mm-hmm.
So they're quoting Mark all the time. Like almost all of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew and Luke. But Matthew and Luke also have new material that they've written about. Some of that new material is also identical in Matthew and Luke. You hear what I'm saying? So you've got material that's only in Matthew and Luke, but it's the same in Matthew and Luke. So some scholars think that they had this other source that they were drawing from. You know what I mean? So they've got the Gospel of Mark, and they've got this other source that they were drawing from. That source is called Q, because it doesn't have a name. Q for Quell, which is just the German word for source. This comes up in German scholarship. Yeah, if you type in like Q source into Google, it should come up. That's right. It refers to a hypothetical lost Greek language collection of Jesus' sayings, also known as the Sayings Gospel, that Jesus believed was used. So what I mean to say is that some scholars believe in the existence of this document called Q, which is a list of sayings of Jesus. It's another so-called Sayings Gospel that Matthew and Luke used as a source. We've never found it. We don't know that it exists. Just from textual analysis, people think that it exists, and there's some debate around that. But the interesting thing is it's a sayings gospel. So the materials that Matthew and Luke both share that aren't in Mark are sayings of Jesus. So there is this known, but we know from the Gospel of Thomas that this is the kind of gospel that does exist, just sayings. And so it's kind of interesting how the Gospel of Thomas, if it were early, might be something a bit like Q. And because some of the quotes in the Gospel of Thomas show up in the Synoptic Gospels, or the canonical Gospels, you then raise the question, well, were the Gospel writers using the Gospel of Thomas as a source? Most scholars reject that. They think Thomas is later. But some people like to entertain it as an idea. At the very least, it's incredibly fascinating. All of these Gospels are like absolutely mental. There's an Apocalypse of Peter where Jesus just describes in detail what happens in hell and what happens to individual people.
What does he say?
So it depends on your sin. I think people who've blasphemed will be hung by their tongues on a bit of rope over like the fire. I think
damn it.
I think women who've had abortions like have to like watch their screaming babies like get boiled alive or something like this. Like it's described in great detail. These texts are absolutely fascinating, man. And there's loads of them. There's just like loads and loads of these different texts, and they all say different wacky, crazy things. But the thing is, a lot of these date much later than the Gospels. Like we're talking possibly hundreds of years afterwards. So.
Which questions the legitimacy of
course,
what they claim.
So you have to bear in mind that a lot of these won't be attached to genuine traditions, but what they do tell us is like they give us insight into what some early Christian communities believed. Like even if you think it's not actually historically connected to Jesus, we know that these are texts that people thought. This is what people actually thought about Jesus. To the extent Gnosticism was so popular, that there's a church father, I can't remember which one, I never can, who is advising early Christians as they're going out to spread the message of the gospel, that when you come onto a new town, don't say to them, take me to your Christian church. Say to them, take me to your Catholic church. Because Catholic just means universal, like small c Catholic. Because otherwise, they might take you to a Gnostic church. So Gnosticism is so popular that Christian believers are being warned to specify what kind of Christian church they want to be taken to, because it's just so popular that you might end up in a Gnostic church. So Elaine Pagels, who you should really have on the show, although I can't remember where she's based, I don't know if she would come into the studio. She wrote a book in the 70s called The Gnostic Gospels, and it is about looking at the Gnostic Gospels and reframing this idea that the early Christian movement was this unified, like self-corroborating set of Christian doctrines, and there were these texts, and they all basically agreed with each other, and people looked at them, worked it out, set the canon, and that was that. But instead, in the early Christian community, there were all of these different competing views of who Jesus was, all of these different like literatures, all of these different ideas, all of these different cosmologies. And it's all of it is fascinating. I mean,
It's so fascinating.
demiurge, creator of the universe, evil material. It's so cool. But that's why you also have to resist it, because it has that Dan Brown level of interest, which makes it cool, but also makes you susceptible to, this is the Billy Carson effect, I think, is when you hear something like, did you know that like Billy Carson thinks that like Catholic churches were built upon like ancient pyramids or something? It's like totally wacky. But if you hear that, if you're the kind of person that goes like, cool, yeah, all right, I'll run with that. Yeah, that works. That checks out. Then, and that can definitely happen here. So you've got to be careful not to give it too much. But it also means that people are intentionally forging things. My favorite gospel forgery is the gospel of Jesus' wife.
Mary Magdalene.
Can you pull up Gospel
You
of
talking
Jesus'
about Mary
wife? Pull up an
Magdalene?
image? Yeah, well, so I'm not talking about Mary Magdalene, but of Jesus' wife, yeah. And just go to, look at the image. Click on that image. So this is a fragment of a bit of papyrus with some...
Is that Sharpie?
No. It's not, because that would be an easy tell. So although there's some forgeries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Washington D.C., there's the Museum of the Bible in Washington D.C.
You don't know?
There's a Museum of the Bible in Washington D.C.
I
You
don't
know that, bro?
I don't think I've ever been there.
You don't know about the Museum of the Bible,
I'm not a
bro?
huge DC guy, man.
Damn, you're not a big Bible guy. You're not a big DC guy.
I'm not a big DC guy.
It doesn't add up.
I've also
together.
been on camera since 12:07 p.m. and it's 9:49, so my memory is like a little.
Yeah,
off
no. It's a museum in DC, right? And it opened fairly recently. I can't remember exactly when. Probably like 20, like in the 2010s, probably, maybe even later, like 2019 or something. Anyway, there are these Dead Sea Scroll fragments. You know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? You've probably done an episode about them, right? So there are these Dead Sea Scroll fragments. They've got, I think, about 10 of them on display. They're forgeries. They end up being proved to be forgeries. And so they had to, firstly, they put up a message which basically said underneath them, these might be forgeries. And then they had to take them down. And my friend Kip Davis, who, I don't know if you've had Kip on the show.
Kip Davis was on Danny's show. I think.
He was. And you should have him on here too. If you want to do a Dead Sea Scrolls episode, he's your guy.
Yeah.
He was one of the people, I think, involved in analyzing these documents. And one of the ways they realized that this is fake is that like if you look at the text, although the papyrus is real and the penmanship is correct and everything, they found like residue of salt on the papyrus, right? Now they were found near the Dead Sea, which is a very salty place, and they could have just been salt for any kind of reasons. However, they did molecular analysis on the salt. Some of that salt, by the way, was underneath the ink. So like baked in, like the text had gone over the top of it. And they did molecular analysis on it and found that it was table salt, which was invented in like the Middle Ages. And so they know that it's forgery, right? What it means is that people do take genuinely ancient papyrus. So if you carbon date it, it checks out, and they write things on it. Like Wes Huff has done that, not in an attempt to forge anything, but to make a facsimile. So just for like a hobby.
I thought you were about to blow my mind for a minute.
So like I think he gave one of these to Joe Rogan. So like there's this document, there's this fragment called P52, which is a fragment of John's Gospel, and I think Wes Huff like takes a bit of ancient papyrus from the actual time and then like copies by hand. So you've got like a sort of fake version of it, which is just like for fun.
Yeah.
So you can do that. So this here, gentlemen, is the Gospel of Jesus' wife. So cool because it's just a fragment of text, which if you click out of it for a second, you'll probably see a bit of information about it. It's 4th century, ignore Forge for now, papyrus fragment with Coptic text that includes the words, Jesus said to them, my wife, and the text received widespread attention. Okay, so it's a fragment that it says, Jesus said to them, my wife. And then at some other point, I think it mentions Mary Magdalene, and it's written in Coptic. Now,
So to be clear, though, this is not the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This is
that's a different thing.
Yes.
Sorry, I hear what you're saying now. There is a separate thing called
Yeah,
the
I just
Gospel
want to
of
make
Mary
sure
Magdalene.
people understand that.
This is the Gospel of Jesus' wife, and like I said, it's just a fragment, and it gets a lot of attention because, again, whether or not you believe that it's actually tied to the historical Jesus, there's been this conspiracy theory for a while that Jesus is married to Mary Magdalene. So at the very least, this might be an ancient document from a community that believed that. Really interesting.
Do you think there's anything to that, by the way?
Probably not. No,
You don't think so?
I don't know, but I think it's really hard to say. Mary Magdalene is like hardly mentioned. Some of the most interesting things about the Gospels is these famous characters don't get like mentioned at all. Like you could read the whole of Matthew's Gospel, and I don't think Mary Magdalene shows up till the resurrection, or like after, or maybe the crucifixion. It's just like you sort of imagine them being there, and they were historically, of course, but in the actual text we have so little information it's impossible to say. We don't even know why she's called Mary Magdalene. Same thing with Judas Iscariot. What does Iscariot mean?
No clue.
Who knows? Some people think that it's. There's a group that there's a word for dagger. I think there's a group of people who are called something like I don't know, I can't remember the word for it, but like the Icarii or something, which sounds like Iscariot, and they were a group of people who would kill Roman officials who were oppressing the Jewish state. And so some people think that Judas was one of these people, and that's where he got his name, because he's Judas the Icarii, or however you say it.
Okay.
And which would make sense because he is kind of an assassin, because he sort of assassinates Jesus, and so that kind of makes sense. Like he might be a zealot. Some people think that there might be like a place, like he's Judas of Iscariot. Same thing with Mary Magdalene. There is a place called like Magdalene or Magdalena or something in Israel, but it's unclear if that place existed, if that's what she was named after, if the place was named after her. I think it's a bit outside of my area of expertise, but like we don't know what Magdalene means, so we know so little about them. But what we do know is that there's this text discovered, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which has this fragment on it and says, in fact, if you scroll down the text word for word, we've got it actually written down. It says, and again, there's a lot missing because it's just a fragment. So, not to me, my mother gave me life, gap, the disciples said to Jesus, gap, Mary is not worthy of it. That kind of sounds similar to the Gospel of Thomas, doesn't it? Mary's not. Jesus said to them, my wife, there's a gap. She is able to be my disciple. There's a gap. Like so it's like, maybe it's Mary Magdalene because she's mentioned, but it's not entirely clear, right? And so there's this big debate about whether it's real or not. Now, there's a lot of research done into this.
All proven forged.
There's a lot of reasons why we might think it's a forgery, but here's my favorite nail in the coffin for why it's a forgery. The Gospel of Jesus' wife quotes the Gospel of Thomas, as I've just said, right?
Mm-hmm.
It quotes the Gospel of Thomas, but it quotes it in a particular translation of the Gospel of Thomas.
What do you mean in particular? Oh, one of the many.
So it's like a translation of the Gospel of Thomas, and on the papyrus, it's quoting the Gospel of Thomas in a particular translation. There is a mistake in the translation of the Gospel of Thomas on the papyrus. So the way the Gospel of Thomas is quoted on this papyrus, on this fragment, is mistaken. It's not actually what the Gospel of Thomas says. Now now a scribe could have just made that mistake, right?
Yeah.
However, there is one other place where this exact same mistake shows up, which is on a website which translates the Gospel of Thomas. And in fact, the line breaking, the formatting of the text was exactly identical to this website that translates the Gospel of Thomas.
Because this was presented in 2012, so this is long after the internet.
That's quite right.
Yeah.
So the chances of that lining up in that way are unfathomably small. So what has happened is somebody has taken, because they carbon dated the papyrus and it's genuinely old. It's like 4th century. So someone has taken a 4th century bit of papyrus
and desecrated it.
And created and forged this fragment. In doing so, they've decided to quote a bit of the Gospel of Thomas, and to get the words right, they've used a website's translation, and they've copied a mistake that was on the website, leaving this digital footprint on this 4th century papyrus. And that's how we know that it's a forgery.
This is why we can't have nice things.
Isn't that cool, man? Isn't that just
wild.
hilarious? It's like the table salt on the Dead Sea Scroll. It's so fascinating. The kind of mistake. I might have butchered it slightly. I mean, I'm not. Can you type in Gospel of Jesus' wife, and then I guess like website maybe, or website translation? see if it comes up with something like that. I think I made a note of it somewhere. Jesus is.
That's just the AI overview. Go down.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I've gotten it.
You want the PDF? The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, Textual Evidence of Modern Forgery?
Oh, here we...
Harvard.
I just wanted to make sure I got all of the details exactly correct. Bart Ehrman's blog's probably got something on it. Yeah, click on that and then just Control F for like website maybe. I don't know if he's written about it. No, maybe not. Okay, or online. Try. Yeah, check this out. Okay, so
I explored the possibility that the text of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife had been prepared using the only Coptic English interlinear translation I knew, in addition to the Gospel of Thomas by Michael W. Grondin, that has been online in various formats since 1997.
I think that might be. I can't. Yeah. So Forgery would have needed to do a little more than cut and paste from Grondin's interlinear.
So long before 2012.
Yeah. So I can't remember all of the details exactly because I can't remember exactly like which language is translated into which language or whatever. But what I do know is that a mistake on the fragment of the papyrus is identical to a mistake that is made on a website, indicating that the person who has written this manuscript, forged this papyrus fragment, has used a website to as the basis of their text, which is just an immediate indication that it's a forgery. I've always found that quite an interesting story. I wish I remembered it better to tell you here today.
You've done a great job telling details today
I'm trying my best.
of all these different nooks and crannies and ins and outs. It's mind blowing stuff. But when did you first start even thinking about this stuff? Like referring specifically to like canonical history, Christian history, how world religion has been formed. Like, were you 10? Were you 15? Like,
no. I mean, like, it's kind of hard to say, but like, so Bart Ehrman is someone that I had on the show because as a sort of atheist debater, God's existence kind of stuff, Bart Ehrman had come up a lot as someone who was a bit outside of my purview because he's a biblical a biblical scholar. I'm more into philosophy of religion. But I was running this podcast and I was like getting guests in and I was like, okay, yeah, I could probably have this Bart Ehrman guy on. So I looked at some of his work and he did some stuff about whether Jesus claimed to be God. And I was kind of, oh, that's kind of interesting. I didn't know that there were all of these arguments. That's kind of fun. If you watch my first podcast with him.
This is only a couple years ago.
Yeah, it's not long ago. Maybe you can pull it up. Alex O'Connor, Bart Ehrman. I've done a few episodes with him. So
wow.
We can find out when it actually was.
So all this knowledge you're spitting.
That was second one down. Did Jesus even claim to be God? So
all this knowledge you're spitting on this stuff is really only in the last couple of years you've looked into this.
That's right. When did this come out?
Amazing.
This came out.
Just click on it.
June 19th, 2023.
2023. So probably filmed a bit before that. That's when this interest. But that's why I say I'm still very much a student here. Like I really can't pass myself off as an expert because I really don't know what I'm talking about. Something that's fun about this video, if you scroll up, check this out. So if you click to like find where the camera's on me anywhere, like just past the beginning, like about halfway through or something. Where the camera anywhere.
Halfway through, or?
Yeah, a bit anywhere from then onwards where the camera's on me.
Seems like it's just on
There you go. So something fun about this interview is that, he does do most of the talking in this conversation. There. Okay, so something that viewers of my show might notice about this is that for the entire interview, notice how I've got my arm propped up like this. Mm-hmm. And at other points I'm holding my notes like this, and it's because when we got into the studio, I said to Bart, "Do you want a coffee?" And he said to me, I remember this distinctly because I found it a little bit strange. He said, "I'd best not have a coffee because I always just spill it down myself." And I was like, okay, fair enough, just me then. So I poured myself a coffee. And then a few minutes into the interview, I spilled my coffee down myself. And Bart sees it. I can see his eyes like flicker and he doesn't know whether to stop, but he just carries on going. And for the rest of the entire interview, I'm sat in this position here with like either holding the cup like over my shirt or I'm like holding my notes so that they cover it up. So like for like an hour and a half straight, I'm just sat in this really, that's so interesting. Oh, yeah, just tell me more. Really contrived position. But so I was talking to Bart, and and if you watch this interview, you'll notice that I'm asking kind of questions and stuff which indicate that I didn't really know much about it at all. Because I'm like, oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. What about this? What about that? Compared to now, it's one of my favorite subjects. So I spoke to Bart, and I was like, this biblical scholarship stuff is actually kind of interesting. Did Jesus claim to be God and all that? That's kind of fun. And then when I put this video out, Christians are responding to it, saying like, oh, Bart Ehrman's wrong, and Jesus did claim to be God. So I'm looking into that, and I'm like, hold on, I think they're wrong. I think they're about it. And then it just snowballs, and I'm just fascinated by it. So it probably had something to do with Bart Ehrman. and suddenly realizing that biblical scholarship is incredibly interesting. But also one of my best friends who's actually sat behind the camera for this interview, his name's John Nelson. He writes a blog called BehindTheGospels.com, which, by the way, you can pull it up actually if you go to BehindTheGospels.com. He does essays on all the kind of stuff we've been talking about. So it's still relative. He's been doing it for like a year and a half or something. And you can see it's like, did Luke know Josephus? So Josephus is a Jewish historian. Did the author of Luke know who he was? Because if he did, that would have implications for the dating of the gospel. Did John know the Synoptics dating the gospels early? What is Q? We just talked about Q. He posted that very recently. So all of the kind of stuff we've been talking about, like Q as a document, the dating, all of this kind of stuff, he writes really, really well on it. And yeah, he's one of my best friends in the world, and he is like razor sharp on biblical scholarship. So I'd have conversations with him, and I would always just be like amazed. But this is so and because he was quite enthusiastic about it, and he's not like a debater or whatever. He's just this very happy, enthusiastic kind of guy, very excited about his work. And so you have dinner with him, and you're just like, dude, this is so interesting. Like, tell me more. And he just knew so much that from a mixture of being friends with him and also speaking to people like Bart Ehrman and then doing more episodes and more research and stuff, suddenly it just became really interesting.
And now it's unbelievable.
And then you're like, you accept a debate. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll do a debate on whether Jesus claimed to be God. And then you've got to go like, head first into study and preparation. And it's just, I've found every single second of it interesting, because this question of whether Jesus claimed to be God, you're looking at Jesus being worshipped. What does worship mean? What is the word for worship in the Gospels? How is it used? Like, what does it mean? You're looking at the forgiveness of sins. You're looking at glory. You're looking at Old Testament references and what all of that means. You're looking at first century Jewish monotheism and what that meant. And it's just like, it opens this door. But I'm fascinated by the historical character of Jesus. I want to know who this man was. I want to know what he was actually saying.
What I like about you, though, is that you're inherently curious and you're open-minded on so many things. It's so obvious, like you want to just keep learning, and it just doesn't just relate to this topic. It relates to other things we talked about as well, and it's obvious looking at some of the videos on your channel too. Like, it's such a breath of fresh air in our world now, where everyone needs to be hardcore. This is 100% what it is, and it's never going to be something different. We need guys like you who are brilliant minds but are curious, and what was that phrase Lee Cronin used? I have strong opinions, loosely held.
Loosely held, not loose opinions, strongly
I love
held.
that. I love that. Like
either that or the other way around, whichever one it is.
Where better evidence comes up, you can shift your position, and like, it's clear, you're asking a lot of important questions today that are also going to be like, all right, well, if this is true, bring me the proof on it, and then we'll talk about it.
Well, thanks, man. And look, I don't have like an axe to grind here. Like, I find this kind of stuff interesting, but I've got no like worldview that I'm trying to defend exactly. Like, I have views about the world, like my view that Jesus didn't claim to be God or whatever it might be, but like, it doesn't like matter to me. It's interesting and it matters because it's important, generally speaking, but it doesn't matter to me on like maybe there's like a sentimental level, because I'm kind of like, oh, this is fun and I like this idea. You've got to sort of try and overcome that within yourself. But like, it's not like if I were a Christian YouTuber and someone proved to me that Jesus didn't claim to be God, that would be like pretty disastrous.
Yes.
And you're like, how do I even approach this? Whereas if someone comes to me and proves that Jesus did claim to be God, it's like, oh, cool. Hey guys, guess what? Jesus claimed to be God. And here's the interesting reason why. And here's why I didn't see it before. Yeah. And here's why, it's just fun, man. I'm just really enjoying it. And people often get me wrong, like, especially with the Gnostic stuff, because I've done like a whole series talking about the Gnostic Gospels. And I often speak quite like tongue in cheek. So when I'm speaking to a Christian, I might like joke about the Gospel of Thomas being the earliest gospel or something. And I think, even though there are some scholars who believe that, but saying things like that, Christians will be like, Alex doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's obsessed with the Gnostic Gospels. And it's like, in a way, yeah, because I find them really interesting. But they act as if I'm like a Gnostic Christian who thinks that the Gospel of Thomas is like accurate.
No, you're just talking about it.
And it's like, no, I just find it kind of fun. But you see, sort of like Christians will sort of say like, oh, this guy is always bringing up the Gospel of Thomas, but we know that the Gospel of Thomas is like forged and it's not correct and it's not true. It's like, no, like, yeah, I know that. I just think that a lot of that's going on in the Synoptic Gospels, in the canonical Gospels too. I'm just interested. And honestly, I just like, sometimes people do ask me that. They're like, why are you so interested in like biblical scholarship? Like, dude, I have got no idea, man.
It's fascinating.
Know. And now I'm so deep into it that like, because the thing about Bart Ehrman is Bart Ehrman used to be like a Christian evangelical fundamentalist. And so he like went to Bible college and like learned so much about the Bible, and now he's like an agnostic atheist, but he's still got all of this Bible knowledge. So he's in a very unique position of being someone who's incredibly knowledgeable about the Bible, but not a Christian. Most people who go really in deep, like balls deep on biblical scholarship, tend to be Christians, because otherwise, what's the point?
Right.
In the day of like YouTube and podcasts and stuff, you get more people who are interested in it. But if you're going to like get a PhD, you're going to study, you're going to spend the money, you're going to get a PhD in biblical scholarship, chances are you're probably a Christian, certainly on the popular level. So Bart Ehrman was in a unique position. If there were a debate about Jesus claiming to be God or something about, not about philosophy, but about the Bible, he's the guy to call. Because who else is doing it? What other like atheist biblical scholars do you have with the same kind of platform? And the more I talk about this, the more I see myself as sort of starting to fulfill that niche. I'm becoming somebody who is willing to talk and debate and have interesting conversations about specifically biblical scholarship, but from an atheist perspective. I mean, the only other people who like approximate this are like Muslims, because Muslims become interested in biblical scholarship because they don't believe that Jesus was God, right? And so the question for them of whether Jesus claimed to be God in the Gospels is incredibly fascinating. But they've also got this motivated reasoning, you know, and they run themselves into trouble because they believe in the Quran. You've got to kind of make the depiction of Jesus in the New Testament line up with the Quran, which is kind of difficult to do, right? So I am fully just this like dude.
Open book.
And I'm just coming in and I'm like, look, I've got this view, but I now occupy this unique niche, which makes it then, so I fell into it kind of by accident, but it's self-motivating now because people now keep coming to me as like someone who's willing to talk about this, but as an atheist. I mean, who else would you go to? Obviously, don't come to me as an expert. Then you go to Bart Ehrman or someone like that. But like, who are you going to go to for like a YouTuber who might have a debate or come on a podcast who'll talk about the Bible, but as an atheist, but like, you know, has a passion for biblical scholarship or something? Like, I feel like I'm fulfilling a niche.
Yeah, I think you are.
I just find it fascinating.
Yeah, man.
Because it opens up doors. You know, I'm fascinated in polemics in the early Gospels and whether you can read into something like, especially John's Gospel, when he says that John the Baptist isn't the Messiah. Does that tell us something about early belief in John the Baptist as the Messiah? Is John responding to Gnosticism? Is John's Gospel influenced by Gnosticism? You know, all of these kinds of questions. It ties together history, belief, philosophy, textual criticism, manuscript tradition, even just the translation stuff is fascinating. Translation philosophy. Earlier you were like, what's translation philosophy? But it's kind of interesting, right? Because you don't think about how to translate a phrase. Like, you know, if somebody says, if somebody says that's not cool, man, and you've got to translate that to somebody who doesn't speak English, and you translate it so that it kind of sounds to them like, that's not cold, human being. That wouldn't get the idea across. So you've got to have a translation philosophy that's not word for word, but phrase for phrase. So you've got to change the meaning. That's really interesting, just on its own. But we've got the translation philosophy stuff. We've got the history stuff. We've got the weird Gnostic cosmology and the philosophy of that. Does it make more sense of the fine-tuning argument? You know, because we talked at the beginning about the evil demiurgic creator. In fact, we'll go full circle, and that's maybe where we can end this, because this came up because we were talking about the fine-tuning argument, right? And the reason that we went off on this mild tangent, if you'll now allow me to get back to the point, is that the fine-tuning...
This mild 4-hour tangent. It's 10:09 p.m. I've been on camera since 12:07.
The fine-tuning argument says that it's really, really difficult to tune the constants. So if they were just a tiny little bit out, the universe couldn't exist. But they are finely tuned. And the question that a Gnostic might ask is like, well, why the meta conditions why do they make it so difficult to create a universe? Why wouldn't God have it so that any strength of gravity or whatever a universe would create? If he wanted to create a universe, why did he make it so difficult? And the Gnostic says, well, he did make it difficult because he doesn't want the material world to exist, because the material world is evil. But the reason that the constants are finely tuned is because it was designed, but it was designed by an evil demiurge. So that explains why it's so finely tuned, because the demiurge tuned it to create the universe. But why the meta conditions make it so difficult to finely tune is because the creator of everything, who sets up the conditions, doesn't want the material world to exist. And so philosophy, and whether that makes sense, fine-tuning argument type stuff, how believing that the material world is evil deals with the problem of suffering and evil. So you've got language, history, philosophy, you've got ethics, you've got textual criticism, you've got sociology, you've got, you know, beef with Wes Huff, you've got the whole thing all wrapped up into one, and it's amazing. And I, as you can probably tell, will not shut up about it until someone tells me to.
You are passionate about it. I love it. When are you in New York next, do you know?
I have no idea.
All right. We got to do another one when you come here. This was incredible, and we got to about 0.01% of what I wanted to talk to you about, because we went very deep on a pretty incredible rabbit hole. But for people who haven't seen your channel, you cover a wide variety of topics.
Definitely.
It's really fascinating. Like I said, I literally found it like last month. So I got to go through a lot of videos myself. But I love the way you think. I love your curiosity. And this is exactly, you're the exact kind of person that I want to see be a leader on the internet, a thought leader, someone who is stimulating the conversation and getting people talking about things that are fun, but also important. And also, you know, maybe we can trail the path or blaze the trail better in the future through some of the things that, you know, we can come to consensus on.
I hope so. I try my best. Anyway, I don't know about thought leader, but hopefully asking interesting questions. And hey, yeah, it was nice to meet you, man. I'll have to
Absolutely, man.
come back, dude.
Thank
All
you.
right. God bless.
All right, you too. Everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. They're both a huge, huge help. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below.